Honourable members, please remain standing as we will be led in the singing of God Save the Queen. Honourable members, please be seated. Members, in April 1926, Alberta's 5th legislature was getting ready to adjourn in advance of the general election to be held in June of that year. However, I imagine the enthusiasm for the upcoming election was slightly overshadowed by the competing headlines across the pond when the Duke and Duchess of York welcomed their first child, Princess Elizabeth. As we all know, Elizabeth would go on to become the Queen at the ripe age of 25. Although officially celebrated in June each year, April 21st, today, marks Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II's actual birthday. Of course, this year is even more to celebrate as Her Majesty celebrates her 96th birthday and marks the 70th year of service during her Platinum Jubilee. As we honor this occasion, I remind members that the Legislative Assembly of Alberta invites you and all Albertans to join in the Jubilee celebrations by composing a congratulatory message for Her Majesty the Queen. Details of the messages can be found in the Visit section of the assembly.ab.ca. Please join me in recognizing the devoted service of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II today on her 96th birthday.
Introduction of visitors. Introduction of guests.
Honourable members, I'm pleased to introduce to you 8 guests seated in the gallery today from the Black Canadian Women in Action. They are guests of the Minister of Labour and Immigration. Please rise and receive the warm welcome of the Assembly. Four special guests of the member for Edmonton Northwest, Vladimir Brill and Erna Brill, 2 Ukrainians who have recently come to Alberta as refugees. They are accompanied today by Marnie Panis and Alex Panis, 2 constituents who are billeting them here in Edmonton. Thank you so much for joining us today. I invite you also to rise and receive the warm welcome of the Assembly.
Ministerial statements. Member statements.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Northwest has a statement to make.
Mr. Speaker, this entire House stands with the people of Ukraine. And I think I can speak for all of us here that we are deeply moved by the suffering being inflicted by the illegal and aggressive invasion by Vladimir Putin's Russia. But in the midst of this tragedy that has created millions of refugees, torn families apart, taken lives and destroyed livelihoods, there are moments that remind us of the good that still exists in the world. We saw the efforts of the former Premier and Deputy Premier filling a plane with 35 tons of aid to the Ukraine, and that same plane brought dozens of Ukrainian refugees back to Edmonton. The support for the people of Ukraine from Albertans has been amazing, and I thank each and every person who has stepped up to do what they can. But today, I want to give a special shout out to some of my constituents today. In the gallery are Marnie and Alex Panas, who, taken 2 refugees recently arrived from the Ukraine. Also joining us in the gallery is Volodymyr Brill and Erna Brill, who arrived here from Ternopil in the western Ukraine, not far from Lviv. We all know the map of Ukraine very well now, don't we? Volodymyr and Irina escaped Russian bombing to Edmonton, where Marnie and Alex, who are also of Ukrainian descent, opened their doors and their home to them. It's a good thing you got a bigger house, eh? I am proud to be able to introduce them as such wonderful, compassionate people to this assembly and all Albertans, and I am proud to represent them here today. They are not alone in stepping up to support the refugees in the Ukraine. Local families across Alberta have opened their homes to fleeing the violence. 50 Ukrainians arrived in Jasper, for example, to find welcoming homes and businesses. While I wish that the reasons for these refugees to come to Alberta to find safety and security from a horrific invasion had not come to pass, but the compassion of Albertans like Marnie, Alex, and so many others continues to show to the world what a welcoming place our province, Alberta, is. Slava Ukraini. Slava.
The honourable member for Spruce Grove, Stony Plain.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've seen time and time again that during their time in government, you can't trust the NDP with Alberta's economy. Today, the Associate Minister of Natural Gas and Electricity released an independent financial review of the balancing pool, which further confirms what we already know, that the NDP value their leftist extremist friends far more than the hardworking Albertans we're all here to serve. The review found that during their ideological mismanagement of the balancing pool, $1.34 billion was lost between May of 2015 and April of 2019. This loss was a direct result of decisions made under the previous government and will have to be paid off by ratepayers until 2030. At a time when utility bills are rising and Albertans are struggling to manage the burden of inflation, the NDP shouts outrage. What they should be shouting is apologies and taking ownership of the $1.3 billion fiasco that they caused. These massive losses are a direct result of their ignorant and ideological market meddling. While in government, the Alberta NDP did nothing to enhance future capacity and oversaw an additional $7.5 billion transmission build-out that wasn't supported by economic growth forecasts. That's a total of $9 billion that they are forcing ratepayers to pay off, and not to mention the effects of their job-killing carbon tax and all the investors that they sent running out of the province. They failed to address the long-term issues facing Alberta's electricity system and left Albertans to pay for their mistakes. We will not be doing the same. With the expiry of the PPAs at the end of 2020s, we will be taking steps to dissolve the balancing pool, which included releasing this independent review while ensuring that no future government can incur losses through this agency. We're doing the hard work to set our province and the electricity grid up for success in the future, which starts and ends with maintaining affordability. Thank you.
The honourable member for Athabasca Barrhead Westlock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For many years, the Trudeau government attacks on Western Canada and its industry seem to have no bounds and no end. From the cancellation of pipeline projects to Bill C-48 banning tankers on the West Coast to Bill C-69, better known as the No More Pipelines Bill. Mr. Speaker, during a time when energy security is paramount and there is a worldwide demand for ethical energy, instead of reducing barriers and supporting the Canadian energy sector, the federal government continues to increase barriers, putting our global competitiveness at risk. The 25% increase of the Trudeau NDP carbon tax on April 1st, when Albertans are already struggling to make ends meet, shows how out of touch he is with the impacts his policies are having on everyday Albertans. But it doesn't end there. Most recently, Trudeau and his Minister of Environment have slyly inserted a discriminating tax against pickup trucks as part of their plan to reach their delusional emissions reduction targets. This hefty, unreasonable Trudeau truck tax is a direct attack on Albertans who purchase about 1/3 of pickup trucks in all of Canada. Mr. Speaker, perhaps our privileged Prime Minister, who is accustomed to trust funds, does not understand the concept of hard, demanding work. The type of work that requires hauling of equipment, tools, and materials that can only be done with trucks. Perhaps our Prime Minister does not understand our agriculture, energy and forestry industries here in Alberta and the industry's reliance on trucks to continue to contribute to billions of dollars, hundreds of thousands of jobs and economic prosperity to all of Canada. Perhaps our Prime Minister does not understand that certain road and weather conditions require such vehicles for transportation and human survival. Mr. Speaker, this is an attack on our Alberta way of life, our ability to earn a living, and on our very means of survival. The fact that the Trudeau government and his NDP allies would accept this as any type of benefit highlights the delusion that Trudeau purports.
Hear, hear. The honourable member for Edmonton Core.
Let's talk about this government's record on utilities. It was months ago when our caucus raised the issue of utility bills hammering small businesses and families. The Associate Minister proudly told this House that his plan was to do, and I'm directly quoting, nothing. Then months later, the Premier decided that action needed to be taken and committed to looking at a natural gas rebate. Our caucus stood with families who told us they were being forced to choose between groceries and paying their bills. Then, in February, the government introduced a budget that didn't mention an electricity rebate, and while it did have a natural gas rebate, it had no details, funding, or plans to implement it. It was a fake program. Our caucus proposed a bill that would protect Albertans from having their power cut off. The UCP voted it down right before a snowstorm hits Alberta. Now they have their own bill, a bill that doesn't guarantee rebates, a bill that has no timelines for providing support to Albertans. The minister who proposed it was asked multiple times when Albertans might see these rebates, and not one time could he answer this simple question. It took the Premier and the Minister weeks to realize their rebates needed legislation, a textbook case of total incompetence, Mr. Speaker. Now, as Albertans cope with utility bills that have reached the thousands and have been climbing for months, this government has done nothing for them. Nothing. Just like the Associate Minister promised, clearly, as he always planned. Mr. Speaker, Albertans need relief. Albertans need support. They need a government that has their best interests at heart and is motivated to serve them. They aren't getting this from this selfish, untrustworthy, and incompetent UCP government. So while the UCP is content to sit back and watch Alberta families struggle, our caucus will continue to be their voice and to advocate for real actions to help them. Albertans deserve better than the UCP.
The honourable member for Carson-Siksika.
Mr. Speaker, the other day, Alberta Health Services announced that Verna Yu would not continue as CEO. In response, the member from Edmonton Strathcona went on Twitter to decry the decision and call my colleague, the member from Peace River, an extremist because he dared to publicly challenge AHS leadership during the pandemic. If it's extreme to represent my constituents in this chamber, like the member from Peace River did, or to question the decisions made by public health officials, or defend thousands of public health care workers from being fired, or university students from getting kicked out of school for not being vaccinated, then color me extreme as well. But let's get serious. We shouldn't throw the word extreme around too lightly. It's not extreme to challenge the mainstream. It is, however, extreme for the member from Edmonton Highlands Norwood, telling Albertans that Extinction Rebellion and their radical views to blow up pipelines have a place in our classrooms. It's extreme that the NDP have adopted the LEAP Manifesto at their annual general meeting in Edmonton, the same LEAP Manifesto that calls for the complete shutdown of Alberta's energy sector, abolishing hundreds of thousands of mortgage-paying, grocery-buying jobs. Extreme is the member from Edmonton City Centre fundraising off of a pandemic, or the member from Edmonton South illegally hacking the Premier of Alberta's personal health information.
Shame.
Finally, extreme.
The honourable member for Carson-Siksika is making a member statement that I appreciate has some vigor involved in it. Members of this assembly make these sort of statements on a very regular basis, whether you are on their team or not. Both sides have heckled during this particular member statement. Everyone is held culpable in that. But as a result, the honourable member for Carson-Siksika is going to be able to start again from the beginning, just as I have allowed the honourable member for Edmonton Whitemud and other places to do the same. I hope that we can contain ourselves over the next 2 minutes while the member has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The other day, Alberta Health Services announced that Verna Yu would not continue as CEO. In response, the member from Edmonton Strathcona went on Twitter to decry the decision and call my colleague, the member from Peace River, an extremist because he dared to publicly challenge AHS leadership during the pandemic. If it's extreme to represent my constituents in the chamber, like the member from Peace River did, or to question the decisions made by public health officials, or defend thousands of public health care workers from being fired, or university students from being kicked out of school for not being vaccinated, then color me extreme as well. But let's get serious. We shouldn't throw around the word extreme too lightly. It's not extreme to challenge the mainstream. Extreme is the member from Edmonton Highlands Norwood telling Albertans that Extinction Rebellion and their radical views to blow up pipelines have a place in our classrooms. Extreme is an NDP that adopted the LEAP Manifesto at their annual general meeting in Edmonton, the same LEAP Manifesto that calls for the complete shutdown of Alberta's energy sector, abolishing hundreds of thousands of mortgage-paying, grocery-buying jobs. Extreme is the member from Edmonton City Centre fundraising off of a pandemic, or the member from Edmonton South illegally hacking the Premier of Alberta's personal health information. Finally, extreme is the member from Edmonton Whitemud, while in this chamber accused me and other male members of the UCP caucus of supporting and engaging in sexual assault, and then refusing to apologize for those disgusting and heinous remarks. Mr. Speaker, this is the People's Chamber, where healthy debate on their behalf is a central pillar of our work. So the next time the leader of the opposition wants to go on social media and insult another member, calling them extreme, I suggest she first open up the camera app to selfie mode. Take a good hard look and ask yourself, who's the real extremist?
Hear, hear.
The honourable member for Edmonton Ellerslie is next.
Mr. Speaker, Ramadan is a very important time of year for Muslims all around the world, during which followers of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, are called to the spiritual refinement. This is achieved through fasting, prayer, study, and most importantly, what is known as zakat. This word is often translated as charity, but that is an incorrect translation. The word zakat in the Quran is described as giving to the poor what is owed to them because of the corruption, sin, and oppression that takes place upon the earth by people. That is to say, where unjust conditions have occurred, it is our responsibility as Muslims to contribute toward redistribution of wealth to make sure that those that are going without are cared for. One group that is doing their part to redistribute wealth is RamadanBasket.ca, a local fundraising initiative by dedicated members of the Muslim community. This initiative started here in Edmonton in 2016 to feed those less fortunate overseas in several countries in the Middle East, Asia, Africa, and Europe during the month of Ramadan. The group wanted me to highlight specifically that this initiative has zero admin fees, so all money collected goes straight to the families being helped. This year, they will surpass $500,000 collected, bringing the total number of families fed to 25,000 during Ramadan. RamadanBasket.ca has brought the whole Muslim community together to work on one united project. Participants include schools and most local masjids in Edmonton and several across Alberta. In order to raise money, local volunteers do everything from organize bottle drives to set up donation booths at many local businesses, and these endeavors have been covered by local media, and for 2 years in a row now, RamadanBasket.ca has been supported by local athlete Alfonso Davies. It is my absolute pleasure to recognize these amazingly hardworking volunteers that have made RamadanBasket.ca a huge success. I congratulate them for bringing their faith into action by helping so many families around the world. May their efforts be recognized by all, including our Creator, and may they be blessed for their good deeds during this blessed month of Ramadan and all year round.
The honourable member for Calgary-Curry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As you know, I often like to take the opportunities in here to highlight good news stories from Calgary-Curry. Today, I rise to tell you about Umoja Community Mosaic, a Calgary-based charity, which is the next chapter of its previous brand, Soccer Without Boundaries, started in Calgary-Curry. Now, as you know, before becoming an MLA, I was not very politically involved. I was a lawyer, paying my bills. I started a local company. I built it up. And every business deal I did included fundraising for charities. That is how I met some amazing community leaders. That is also how I met Jean-Claude Munyezamu. Jean-Claude Munyezamu is the founder of Umoja Community Mosaic. He escaped the genocide in Rwanda, found his way to Canada, and then in 2010, noting that children in his neighborhood were getting into trouble, Jean-Claude took some soccer balls to a nearby park on a Saturday morning, and Soccer Without Boundaries was born. Now, what you might not tell, what he probably wouldn't tell you, is that he actually had to clear the park first of a bunch of drug dealers who had set up shop there. From its humble soccer beginnings, Umoja Community Mosaic has grown to provide many community services. It now provides culturally sensitive food hampers to over 3,500 people in need. The soccer program now has over 650 kids. There are after-school programs, community-based tutoring, arts, crafts, music programs, and I could go on. Umoja and the good work that it does would not exist without Jean-Claude. He has received more awards and accolades than I can even list, including the 2019 Immigrant of Distinction Award, the 2021 Community Justice Award for Leadership. He is an anti-racism pioneer. He is a true change maker. It is organizations like Umoja Community Mosaic that need our support. So if you can, please donate. Go to www.umojamosaic.org/donate today. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable members, the time is 1:50, and that makes it oral question period. And the honourable member for Calgary Mountain View has question 1.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday, the UCP unveiled legislation to implement a utility rebate they promised Albertans months ago. I would say it's a case of better late than never, except the minister said Albertans will still have to wait months more. The minister gave many excuses yesterday, but it all comes down to this. It will be months before Albertans see a single dime of relief. This is a brutal failure by the UCP and a demonstration of total incompetence. To the Premier, you're already months behind. Why will it take several more months to help Albertans struggling to pay their energy?
The Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, in fact, this government is taking real action to help address the rising cost of electricity, which is largely the result of reckless NDP policies like their power purchasing agreement fiasco. Just today, the Minister for Natural Gas and Electricity released our promised audit of the PPA fiasco under the NDP, demonstrating that they cost electricity consumers $1.3 billion on that alone, in addition to their carbon tax. There's $7.5 billion on transmission costs. But, Mr. Speaker, we want to get that relief to Albertans, so why is the NDP holding up the bill and delaying that utility relief?
The Honourable Member for Calgary Mountain View.
That is categorically false, as usual, but let's talk about the bill we're here to debate. The House is a place of democracy, and as the member of the official opposition, it is not my job to rubber stamp the government's bill. It is our job to make them better. You know what would get these rebates moving faster, Mr. Speaker? A real legislated timeline, a commitment in writing to force the UCP to get the money flowing. Would the Premier support adding a legislative timeline to deliver this rebate? Yes or no?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, first of all, I have to apologize to the House. I was inaccurate earlier on when I said that the NDP's power purchasing agreement fiasco cost ratepayers $1.3 billion. In fact, the audit conducted and released today demonstrates that it was $1.34 billion. $1.34 billion on top of $7.5 billion in unnecessary transmission costs, on top of their carbon tax, on top of the billions in shutting down the coal plants, Mr. Speaker. Shame on them for driving up electricity prices for Albertans and for blocking today's relief.
Here. The Honourable Member.
Blaming others is all this Premier knows how to do. It's weak leadership, Mr. Speaker. The Premier wants to talk about the past, but he doesn't want to talk about the conservative decision to overbuild transmission lines. He doesn't want to talk about the failure of the deregulated market to actually increase competition. He doesn't want to talk about the fact that power companies are jacking up their markups to squeeze more profits out of Alberta families. Will the Premier commit to an independent public inquiry into power costs to give Albertans the full pictures, not UCP half-truths?
The Honourable Premier.
We just released an independent audit of the NDP's PPA fiasco. $1.34 billion down the toilet. And she talks about these decisions as though they're just in the past. Here's what the NDP doesn't understand in their illiteracy about economics and about energy markets, that those prior errors, shutting down the coal plants, the carbon tax, the PPA fiasco, the overbuild on transmission, all of those are costs now passed on to taxpayers, so why won't they support the bill to get that relief to Albertans right away?
The Honourable Member for Lethbridge West.
Now, Mr. Speaker,
Speaker, Albertans have been absolutely sideswiped by massive increases to their car insurance. They want to know why. Part of the problem here is the UCP government removed the NDP's cap on insurance premiums after a few meetings with their friends in the big insurance lobby. Now, yesterday, when I asked who these lobbyists met with, the Premier said, "Oh, not me." Okay, then, let's find out who. Will the Premier table all meeting minutes, agenda items, correspondence, and calendars detailing UCP meetings with insurance lobbyists today?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, that's patently ridiculous. There's 25,000 people that work in the government of Alberta. I don't track every single meeting. I can say I never met with any lobbyists to discuss lifting the cap. We received advice from the Treasury Board and Finance. It was accepted by Cabinet to stop the flight from the Alberta market of insurers. The situation where tens of thousands of people could not get insurance and where many people were having to pay 100% of their premiums up front because the NDP had made such a hash of the insurance market. Thankfully, Mr. Speaker, we now see premiums coming down, and we implore the insurance companies to continue that downward momentum.
The Honourable Member for Lethbridge West.
Mr. Speaker, I don't trust this Premier's word. MLAs on both sides of this House don't trust the Premier's word, and Albertans don't trust the Premier's word. So here's what we do know. UCP insiders, including the Premier's close friend and campaign manager, Nick Holzbergen, lobbied the government to take the cap off. The Premier caved, and now Albertans are paying hundreds of dollars more. So once more, will the Premier tell us exactly who in Cabinet or on their staff met with car insurance lobbyists and table those documents?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the member knows perfectly well that lobbyists have to report meetings with public office holders. The reality is this. The NDP screwed up the market. They were driving insurers out of Alberta because, Mr. Speaker, they took no action. This government did. We brought in legislation to limit soft tissue personal injury awards that were increasing significantly the cost of insurance. We've taken measures that have brought more insurers back into the market, and that is exactly why premiums are now going down.
The Honourable Member.
You know, the Premier spins this story about the hard-knock life of the multi-billion-dollar insurance industry and says they have it so tough. He says they were looking to leave the province. None of them did. And in 2020, those companies raked in $1 billion more in premiums than they paid out in claims. Albertans are shedding no tears for them. Why did the Premier let these big, profitable companies take Albertans for a ride? Why did he put his lobbyist friends first and Alberta drivers last? And for the last time, Mr. Speaker, where are those meeting documents?
The Honourable the Premier.
Once again, the NDP completely screwed up the insurance market such that companies were no longer providing coverage in Alberta. Many people, I recall 3 years ago, that we were all as MLAs hearing from constituents who said they could not get insurance and they couldn't afford to pay up front for the whole year. And, Mr. Speaker, that's what they left, the disaster that they left us with, which is why we brought in Bill 43 that has begun to reduce the cost of payouts by insurance companies, and that's why premiums are now coming down.
The Honourable Member for Calgary Buffalo is next.
On June 13, 2020, a terrible hailstorm swept across northern Calgary and nearby communities. It severely damaged homes, vehicles, businesses, and farms. The storm caused more than $1.2 billion in damage, one of the most expensive natural disasters in Canadian history. But that's just the beginning. For months and months, the Premier and his UCP government turned their backs on the people of Calgary. Why did the UCP refuse to activate the disaster recovery program to help families and businesses recover from the hail damage they suffered?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, we're all disturbed to see the huge costs imposed on many families, not just in Northeast Calgary, other parts of Southern Alberta during those hailstorms. I am pleased to report that 1 year out, over 90% of claims have been fully resolved, and the remaining 10% outstanding are well into the claims process. So I don't know why the NDP is trying to politicize the process where people have home insurance, they've received the benefits that they are entitled to. In other cases, they're working through that, Mr. Speaker. That's exactly how it should work.
That's right. The Honourable Member for Calgary Buffalo.
Many Northeast residents who didn't have hail insurance got no help from the UCP. And the residents who did have that insurance, they got the runaround from their insurance companies for months. There are families and businesses in Northeast Calgary, we just heard, who still haven't got their claims paid out 2 years later. And of course, the UCP took the side of their friends in the insurance industry. Premiums are soaring, even while some families are repairing the damage out of their own pockets. Why did this Premier and the UCP government refuse to help the people of Northeast Calgary and choose instead to help their wealthy friends in the insurance industry?
The Honourable Premier.
What in the world is he talking about, Mr. Speaker? People buy insurance when they incur damage, it's validated, and they get their payments, they get their benefits. That's exactly the legal obligation of the insurance firms. Is the member now suggesting that the taxpayer should be forced to insure losses for people who do not acquire insurance? Then why would anybody buy insurance, Mr. Speaker? Yeah. It's called moral hazard. It would be, it would impose billions of costs of dollars on taxpayers. I guess that's the socialist way. Yeah.
The honourable member.
What this member knows is that the UCP refused to help Calgarians, but other levels of government did so. The City of Calgary provided $3,000 rebates for homeowners to replace hail-damaged roofs with new hail-resistant roofs. It's such a good program that they're oversubscribed. They have many more eligible households than they can afford at the City of Calgary. Here's the promise, Mr. Speaker. An NDP government will bring provincial dollars to this program, make sure every eligible household in Calgary gets help with hail-resistant roofs. That's a promise.
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the disaster resistance program provided significant funding to uninsurable losses under the same policy the NDP government had in place. But you know, what a shell game. Here they are trying to politicize this when the insurance policy of this government is the same as the NDP government, which is to say people have an obligation to insure their homes against damage of this nature. And now the NDP is saying that we should remove that obligation and move it all on to taxpayers. That's why, Mr. Speaker, if they were still in office, we'd have a multi-billion-dollar deficit. Right.
The honourable member for Edmonton Highlands Norwood.
Teachers involved in the writing of curriculum? Seems reasonable, right? Well, according to at least one UCP MLA, not so much. In a meeting with the Coaldale Council, the MLA for Tabor-Warner stated that he wasn't sure having teachers involved would be critical in determining a good curriculum. That same UCP curriculum opposed by teachers, students, parents, school boards, Indigenous communities, Francophone Albertans, so many more. So does the Premier share his MLA's view that excluding teachers makes the curriculum better?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, teachers have been deeply involved in the development of the revised curriculum. Over 100 teachers have been involved in the formal consultation advisory committees with the Minister of Education. The revisions have been delayed to take on board more constructive input, for example, in the social studies curriculum. But the real question is, why does the NDP oppose world-leading techniques for language arts and math instruction based on the best practices around the world? Why do they want to continue to hold Alberta students back? Why do they impose these meaningful improvements in both reading and mathematics?
The honourable member for Edmonton Highlands Norwood.
We know that when it comes to this curriculum, the UCP has a clear vision. The Premier's racist friend who slammed the Pope's apology for residential schools, he got to hold the pen, while teachers are told by the UCP that their involvement isn't necessary to create a good curriculum. Albertans know that the opposite is true. So can the Premier explain why Chris Champion got to write the first draft of the curriculum, while teachers are cast aside and told that their input isn't necessary?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, in their ideological zeal to impose their left-wing agenda in the schools, the NDP is jeopardizing life-learning chances for Alberta students. Sarah Sarich, the president of Decoding Dyslexia, wrote yesterday in the Journal that the new English language arts curriculum will prevent the systemic discrimination of students who struggle to read and has the potential dramatically to improve literacy rates for all Alberta students. Why does the NDP oppose the right to read for Alberta students?
The honourable member.
Albertans know that this government doesn't value value teachers, something that was only confirmed when we saw the MLA for Tabor-Warner tell his constituents that involving teachers wouldn't make the curriculum better. And since this government is funding 1,000 fewer teachers, showing that not only do they not value teachers in curriculum, they don't value them in the classrooms either. So does the Premier think that excluding teachers and continually disrespecting them will get his dumpster fire of a curriculum a passing grade? Because let me tell you, Albertans are saying loudly and clearly, it's a huge fail.
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, again, the NDP is trying to hold back significant improvements in math proficiency and in literacy. Dr. Wintran Davies, a very powerful advocate for elementary education, says it took 8 years of advocacy for me to see this. A curriculum that is clear, concise, age-appropriate, and well-sequenced. It is a curriculum that sees and realizes our children's fullest potential. They will have the confidence and skills to pursue their dreams and succeed not only in the STEM fields, but also in life, unquote. Mr. Speaker, why does the NDP oppose this concrete progress for elementary school kids?
Here. The Honourable Member for Calgary-Klein has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, AIMCO is a very important Alberta institution that generates returns for all Albertans in the Heritage Savings Trust Fund, but also for thousands of public sector servants whose pension contributions rely on AIMCO investment performance. The professional experience of investment managers at AIMCO mean high returns for pension holders, which in turn reduces contribution rates. To the President of Treasury Board and the Minister of Finance, what is the state of AIMCO's investment performance for 2021?
The Honourable the Minister of Finance and the President of Treasury Board.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for that great question, because I'm very pleased to rise and talk about the status of AIMCO's returns. In fact, yesterday, AIMCO announced a record annual value add of $7.7 billion, Mr. Speaker. That's over and above the benchmark rate. Mr. Speaker, for the year end December 31st, the total fund return was 14.7%, 8% over their benchmark. I'm very pleased to say that this marks the strongest year of returns ever for AIMCO.
Hear, hear.
The Honourable Member for Calgary-Klein.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that that is absolutely amazing news, and given that during the Budget 2022 consultations and following the news of Alberta's first balanced budget in more than a decade, Albertans wanted to know what was happening with the Alberta Heritage Savings Trust Fund. And given that AIMCO announced incredible results for 2021 yesterday, and that the Heritage Fund has also had incredible results presented in Budget 2022, can the Minister of Finance tell us what the status of the Heritage Savings Trust Fund is today?
The Honourable the Minister of Finance, President of Treasury Board.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to provide that information. The Heritage Fund has seen 7 quarters of positive returns. In fact, the first 3 quarters of the previous fiscal year, Mr. Speaker, the fund generated more than $2 billion at a rate of 14.5%. At the end of December, the Heritage Savings Trust Fund had an $18.9 billion balance of net assets, Mr. Speaker. We remain focused on ensuring the Heritage Fund continues to be a source of pride and security for all Albertans.
Hear, hear.
The Honourable Member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that in 1976, Premier Peter Lougheed established the fund to provide for future generations, and over the years, government after government has pulled money out of general revenue into general revenue, and given that our government has balanced the budget and is looking forward to contributing to the Heritage Savings Trust Fund in the near future, can the Minister of Finance tell us what his vision is for the Heritage Savings Trust Fund going forward?
The Honourable Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. One advantage of fiscal discipline is a balanced budget. An advantage of a balanced budget is it gives a government and a people options. Mr. Speaker, we committed to reinvesting any surplus back into the Heritage Savings Trust Fund this year. Mr. Speaker, I will reiterate that commitment today in front of this House and in front of Albertans.
Hear, hear.
The Member for St. Albert.
While this government can't even figure out how to get the utility rebates they promised out the door, Alberta families are struggling with inflation. The Calgary Food Bank is reporting a year-over-year increase in demand from 11 to 20%. Over 47,000 were served last month, an increase of over 10,000. The Premier and government are ignoring the increasing number of Albertans who need support to actually put food on the table. What tangible support can the Minister of Finance offer these families who have been left behind by a government? And they really are struggling to make ends meet right now.
The Honourable Minister of Finance, President President, Treasury Board.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the member's question because there's no doubt inflation is creating cost pressures for all Albertans and many Alberta households. Mr. Speaker, that's why we moved forward with the electricity rebate, Mr. Speaker. Every household will receive an electricity rebate in the weeks and months coming up. On top of that, Mr. Speaker, we have suspended the fuel tax. Again, every Alberta motorist, every small business will not pay any fuel tax for the first quarter. That may be extended for the full year. Mr. Speaker, on top of that, we're delivering responsible fiscal management.
Hear, hear.
The honourable member for St. Albert.
Talking about real people right now, given that this punishing inflation that is making hurtful UCP policy decisions even worse, and given that the UCP chose to use inflation to take thousands from seniors, disabled Albertans and students, and given that the Calgary Food Bank is reporting that they're dealing with people who are at a crisis level right now, who have used up all of their resources, will the Finance Minister step in by ending his policy of using inflation to take food away from the most vulnerable?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Well, again, Mr. Speaker, we're moving forward with a number of initiatives that will provide relief for Alberta households and families. Moreover, Mr. Speaker, Budget 2022 was about positioning this province for increased investment attraction, increased job creation, increased opportunities for every Albertan. Mr. Speaker, right now there are tens of thousands of employers right across the province looking for additional employees. Now is a great time for Albertans to step into that labour market, a great time for employees to take on a job or upgrade a job, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for St. Albert.
Given this government has systematically made life more difficult by de-indexing benefits that were already poverty level. The Business Council of Alberta is reporting a 4% decrease in average household incomes. And given that this would be an ideal time for the UCP to end their policy of taking $1 billion from Albertans in the form of a sneaky bracket creep tax hike so that families can afford to buy groceries or re-index benefits at the very least, will the Finance Minister admit that Alberta families are struggling to put food on the table right now and do something? End this bracket.
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and we are taking action right now, again, with a whole host of relief programs, including the suspension of the fuel tax, Mr. Speaker. We're positioning this province for increased opportunities, Mr. Speaker, for every Albertan. And on top of that, Mr. Speaker, we're delivering responsible fiscal management. We inherited a fiscal train wreck from the members opposite, Mr. Speaker. That would have given this government no options to provide relief today to ensure our programs are sustainable for tomorrow. Mr. Speaker, we're taking real action.
The honourable member for Edmonton Northwest has a question.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister for Advanced Education approved enormous exceptional tuition increases for next year and then keeps bragging in this House that Alberta's tuition isn't that expensive because last year Alberta was still below the national average. Since this minister won't level with students and families about the real cost of education in Alberta, allow me to do so. Over their degree, this is how much more the University of Alberta will pay than the Canadian median. Law, $6,600. Business, $6,400. Engineering, $1,300. Dentistry, $45,780. Wow. How can this minister defend
the Honourable
rates?
Minister of Finance. Or correction, Advanced Education.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I didn't quite hear a question in there. You know, I think we've been over this in the past, but happy to go over it again for the benefit of the member. According to Statistics Canada, tuition in Alberta today remains below the national average. And with respect to some of the programs that the member is referencing, many of those programs also continue to remain below the national average. As a quick example, Mr. Speaker, the University of Alberta's MBA will be $24,000 for new incoming students. Across the U15, it's $29,000. So prices in Alberta continue to remain competitive.
The honourable member for Edmonton Northwest.
Well, Mr. Speaker, given that this minister claims that these enormous hikes are a good deal because they will increase program quality for students, but given that the students in the programs don't seem to agree. Student representatives and programs have spoken out against tuition increases because of the massive cost to students and lower quality of education. Given that the minister himself gave himself the power to approve these increases without the support of students, something that would not have happened under NDP government, if the minister's gigantic increases are such a good deal, why do students not want them?
The Honourable Minister of Advanced Education.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As the member opposite mentioned, these increases must go to improve the quality of the program, and that's precisely where those increases will go. The institutions have submitted very robust proposals providing details as to how those increases will improve the quality of the program, and that will indeed be the case as well. A section of that revenue will also go to strengthen student assistance and provide more support and financial assistance to students in those programs. But again, as I referenced earlier, many of those programs still remain competitive with the national average.
The Honourable Member.
Well, Mr. Speaker, given that the minister claims that he cares about student consultation, but FOIP requests by the student union have showed that the deans of the affected faculties did not think that they had enough time to do a consultation properly. Given that all of these consultations were crammed into final exams June 2021 into the busy first weeks of September classes, and so the rushed amateur hour proposals that this minister approved are a direct result of these timelines. Why did the minister force students and universities to rush to develop these important proposals in such a short time?
The Minister of Advanced Education.
Mr. Speaker, we didn't force and rush anyone to do anything. The universities have the discretion to submit the proposals whenever they want, and it's completely within their discretion. There are no timelines as to when the proposals must be received. And in fact, when we first received the proposals, we sent them back to ask the university to engage in more consultation. So I'm not sure I have no idea, Mr. Speaker, what timelines the member is referring to, because there are no timelines of the process. It's completely up to the discretion of the universities and the institutions as to how they want to manage that process.
The Honourable Member for Lethbridge East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Nurse practitioners are an important part of Alberta's healthcare system. They are registered nurses with graduate degrees and perform many similar duties that physicians do, such as diagnosis, treatment, prescription of medications, and many more. With the current struggles facing our rural healthcare system, nurse practitioners might be a great solution to a very real problem. Can the Minister of Health please tell this House about his department's efforts to bring more of these talented healthcare workers into our communities?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Honourable Member for the question. Mr. Speaker, nurse practitioners can provide many of the same services as doctors, and they play a vital role in our plan to address the ongoing concerns concerning rural healthcare. That's why we initiated the Nurse Practitioner Support Program. We also updated regulations to increase their scope of practice, allowing them to complete driver medical examination forms and work as medical directors and provide real-time advice to paramedics. Mr. Speaker, we'll keep working to ensure nurse practitioners can provide quality health care for all Albertans, particularly in rural Alberta.
Member for Lethbridge East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to the Minister for his answer. As I mentioned earlier, given that nurse practitioners can perform, certainly not all, but many of the same functions as physicians, and given that timely access to quality health care is a major concern for the residents of Lethbridge and the surrounding area, through the Speaker to the same Minister, does he see an opportunity for nurse practitioners to be more involved in Southern Alberta's healthcare system, and are they looking to attract these practitioners to Lethbridge?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thanks again, Mr. Speaker, and thanks again to the Honourable Member for his advocacy for Lethbridge. Mr. Speaker, we recognize the need in Lethbridge and in other communities. We started the Primary Care Nurse Practitioner Support Program to hire 80 new nurse practitioners. AHS has already hired 50 new nurse practitioners and is currently in talks with 20 more candidates. There are 2.8 full-time equivalent NP positions located in Lethbridge, and they're under active recruitment right now. Albertans deserve the same level of care regardless of where they live. Mr. Speaker, we are endeavouring to deliver that.
Member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and once again to the same Minister for his answer. Given that I have raised the recent issue of the lack of doctors in Lethbridge directly with the Minister, and given my constituents are rightly concerned about their access to quality health care as a result, and given that government's commitment to addressing the health care of rural Albertans, can the Minister give an update on the current efforts to attract more doctors to Lethbridge and ensure Southern Alberta maintains access to quality health care that they deserve?
The Minister.
Thanks again, Mr. Speaker, to the member for his continuing advocacy. AHS is currently recruiting 26 family medicine positions in Lethbridge, and they've interviewed to date 23 candidates. 10 of those candidates have committed to work in Lethbridge and are awaiting their CPSA assessments. Another 5 physicians already working in Lethbridge as locums have been offered permanent positions there, and 3 of them have accepted. Mr. Speaker, I hope to see them stay and work in Lethbridge and to see new physicians join them in the coming weeks as I provide more information to my colleagues here in Lethbridge.
The honourable member for Edmonton City Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The UCP's attacks on Alberta's healthcare system are harming families in every part of our province. Dozens of communities have partially closed hospitals. Tens of thousands of people in Lethbridge can't find a family doctor. And now this shortage is spreading into the Bow Valley, where there isn't a single doctor in the region accepting new patients. And in Canmore, those without a doctor now are losing access to a walk-in clinic. We haven't heard a word about this from the member for Banff-Kananaskis, so I'll ask the Minister of Health. Why, under the UCP government, are whole regions of Alberta continuing to lose access to a family doctor?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
I thank the honourable member for the question. This is an important issue. We recognize there are challenges in finding primary care in rural Alberta. Mr. Speaker, this is an issue not only affecting Alberta, but it's affecting all provinces across the entire country. As I indicated to my honourable colleague from Lethbridge, we are utilizing PCNs to be able to help fill the gap. Plus, we are actively recruiting family doctors across the entire province. I can advise the honourable member across the way that AHS and Covenant is recruiting to fill 2 recent family physician vacancies in the Canmore region, and we're going to continue to work.
The honourable member for Edmonton City Centre.
Given, Mr. Speaker, that this is an issue this government has actively made worse, because given last week I stood with Dr. Brendan Flowers, a family physician who practices in Canmore, one of the most beautiful places in the world, and yet they're struggling to find doctors willing to work there. And given that as doctors retire without being replaced, the workload on Dr. Flowers and his colleagues is increasing, putting them at risk of burnout and early retirement. And given that Dr. Flowers said decisions of this UCP government are making it harder to attract doctors to Alberta in the Bow Valley, what specifically is this minister doing to undo the damage his government created?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, let's set the record straight. In a recent report, it demonstrated that if we compare Q1 last year to Q1 this year, 99 more doctors came to Alberta than left the province or left the practice. Mr. Speaker, we are committed to be able to increasing our supply of healthcare professions in rural Alberta. That's why last year we committed $90 million to rural programs, and this year we've committed the same amount, Mr. Speaker. You know, we've been through 2 years of challenges through the pandemic. That's put a stress on the system, but we are focused on getting practitioners in healthcare in rural Alberta.
The honourable member.
Given, Mr. Speaker, that the minister can spin, but Albertans see the reality on the ground, and given that the Alberta Medical Association says the rate of doctors retiring has doubled in the past 2 years under this government, and given that Alberta's medical schools are reporting dozens of unfilled family residencies this year, and given the hostility from this UCP government to doctors, the entire frontline healthcare team is clearly not only driving current doctors, but also future doctors away from working in Alberta. Will Albertans have to wait for a change in government to see new doctors come back to the Bow Valley and other communities in need across Alberta?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, I just want to be clear and let's set the record straight. We are investing in our healthcare system. Additional $600 million this year, $600 million next year, $600 million the year after that, $1.8 billion, Mr. Speaker. We are invested in capital, some of the highest levels ever, $3.5 billion over the next few years, Mr. Speaker. We're investing in rural healthcare, and this is a challenge not only being faced Alberta, but it's being faced across the country. We have more doctors here now. We have more nurses. We have more paramedics. Mr. Speaker, we are supporting our healthcare system. We will support our rural docs, and we will support to make sure that rural Albertans can get the health care that they need where they need it.
The honourable member for Edmonton Riverview is next.
With the cost of living continuing to increase, many Albertans are struggling to afford a home. I was glad to see that the recently released federal budget recognized this and expanded the national housing strategy to spend a total of $72 billion on affordable housing. Sadly, the UCP has continually left federal money untouched, ignoring the calls of municipalities, housing providers, and business leaders. Will the UCP finally change course and work to access every single federal dollar possible for affordable housing?
The Honourable Minister of Children's Services.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we are in fact taking the time to review the recent federal budget and its commitments to housing. I know that my colleague looks forward to getting more details in the coming days, particularly, Mr. Speaker, in terms of how much new federal housing funding will be allocated for Albertans and how the new dollars and initiatives will align with Alberta's 10-year affordable housing strategy, Mr. Speaker. We are committed to working with community partners and governments at both municipal and federal levels on this very important issue.
The honourable member for Edmonton Riverview.
Given that downtown revitalization and economic recovery requires investment in affordable housing, chambers of commerce and business associations across the province have advocated for permanent solutions to address poverty and homelessness. Given that this federal funding is a great way to quickly use available space in communities and convert it to housing, with so much new funding available, will the UCP finally work with communities, become a true partner, and invest in new affordable housing?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services is rising.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As I said before, we are absolutely committed as a government to partnering with our municipal and federal partners in this, Mr. Speaker, as well as community organizations, Mr. Speaker. You know, in the first question, the member opposite, Mr. Speaker, asks about leaving federal dollars on the table. Nothing could be further from the truth, Mr. Speaker. It is actually quite shameful that the NDP are once again not telling the whole picture when they do, in fact, Mr. Speaker, know better. They're fully aware of the terms and conditions for Alberta to receive federal funding under the NHS, including what Alberta's maximum allocation will be and how much Alberta will receive in relation to other provinces.
The honourable member.
Given, Mr. Speaker, that $187 million was left on the table, and given that a clear solution to access more federal funding for housing is for the UCP to simply invest their fair share, as well as work with municipalities and providers to navigate federal programs, and given that the UCP have left housing providers high and dry, I have heard from some who have taken funds away from their needed services to hire consultants to navigate federal programs. This could all be avoided if the UCP were simply a willing partner. Why does the UCP refuse to do the bare minimum to receive available federal funding?
The Honourable Minister of Children's Services.
Mr. Speaker, once again, the NDP are fully aware of the terms and conditions for Alberta to receive federal funding under the NHS, including what Alberta's maximum allocation will be, $561 million, and how much Alberta will receive in relation to other provinces and territories, as they, Mr. Speaker, signed the original agreement in 2019. It is, however, Mr. Speaker, our government that has continuously pushed for more flexibility and collaboration with the federal government to find better housing solutions for Albertans.
The honourable member for Livingston-McLeod has a question to ask.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For far too long, students in Alberta have struggled to learn to read and write. Families have had to spend thousands of dollars on tutors, and those who can't afford it have simply fallen behind. Alberta data shows that approximately 30% of students are struggling readers, and that is only what we know from the very few school boards who track that data. Many do not. To the Minister of Education, what is this government doing to ensure that our students do not fall behind?
Good question.
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I recently released final curriculum for K-6 English Language Arts and Literature. This curriculum was developed using expert advice and world-class research. We are taking a scientific approach to improving literacy rates. This approach also includes the introduction of mandatory learning assessments for language, a key UCP commitment in our 2019 election platform. Mr. Speaker, promise made, promise kept.
The honourable member for Livingston-McLeod.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Minister for her answer. Given that the Minister did explain that this is a science-based approach, and while all I'm hearing from members opposite and from the teachers' union is criticism, and given that members opposite are loud and angry and the ATA is spending thousands of dollars to convince Albertans that this is an evil and racist curriculum, I'm wondering, Mr. Speaker, what do the experts say? Does the Minister have any experts who have spoken out in support of this approach to curriculum and assessment?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I certainly do. When asked about the new mandatory language assessments, Pamela Gibble, Superintendent of Lakeland Catholic, said, and I quote, "These assessments are necessary because they provide important information about student learning, which allows our teachers to apply ongoing research-based instruction as well as literacy and numeracy intervention. And Dr. George Giorgio of the University of Alberta said, and I quote, "The new English language arts and literature curriculum is grounded in research and allows for explicit and systemic instruction in foundational skills."
Good stuff.
The honourable member for Livingston McLeod.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that there are University of Alberta professors, there are parents, and there are other advocates who support this curriculum, and given that many of these experts specifically support the math curriculum, and given that the NDP would prefer our students flounder in discovery math in their classrooms, can the minister assure this House that these new assessments will also support students struggling to keep up in math class?
The Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The short answer is yes. We've released a strong new mathematics curriculum, and with it, new mandatory learning assessments that build on the important work we did this school year to identify struggling learners. Dr. Martin Masrick of the University of Alberta said, and I quote, "The revised K-6 mathematics curriculum includes strengthened content that fosters core competencies in math. This included reinforcing basic fundamentals in a well-sequenced manner that will promote a student's understanding of math in a real-world context." Mr. Speaker, our kids need this desperately.
The honourable member for Edmonton Decore.
As of March 31st last year, this government decided that diagnostic imaging services like x-rays, ultrasounds, bone scans, MRIs ordered by chiropractors, physiotherapists, and audiologists would no longer be covered by Alberta Healthcare Insurance Plan. They decided that the best time to act on this was in the middle of a pandemic, and it was completely fine for Albertans to pay out of pocket. The colleges of chiropractors and physiotherapists have conducted research and found that it is crystal clear that this policy is severely detrimental to Albertans, to their health, and their finances. Will the minister listen to Albertans and reverse these failed changes?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
So I thank the honourable member for the question. This is an important issue. As the honourable member is aware, we did an assessment of the provisions of the services being ordered by for chiropractors, for example. Wasn't able to do this in other provinces, and we looked at this, and we understood that many people who are actually advised of the service had private coverage. We also understood that for those who actually needed to be able to do this and didn't have private coverage, would have the opportunity to go see a family doctor to do this. We did this as a cost-saving measure, but I'm happy to speak with the physiotherapists and the chiropractors to better understand their report and understand the implications of it.
The honourable member for Edmonton Decore.
Given that the ACAC reported that one Albertan had to live with an untreated heel fracture for over a year because of the inefficiency created by this policy, this was one of many testimonies they collected. And given this policy has only created more red tape for Albertans to jump through, and it forced them to wait while their pain increases, their bones degenerate, their surgeries are pushed back. How can the minister justify this policy? Does he know how it's affecting Albertans? Can he tell us about it? Or has he been sitting bone idle as Albertans suffer because of these hurdles the government has created?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to learn more about that particular incident because as I indicated, the change in the policy was about who is able to requisition an insured service. A doctor is able to requisition an insured service like an MRI or a scan. So if the individual in that particular case went to see their doctor and there was an issue there, that actually could be requisitioned by that individual. Or alternatively, many individuals have private plans, and so if a chiropractor does the requisitioning, then it'll be paid for under the private plan. So, Mr. Speaker, again, as I previously indicated, we put this in as a cost-saving measure. We did an assessment on this. However, if there are other assessments out there that suggest that there are other ways to do that, provide better care and manage our costs, I'm happy to take a look at it.
The honourable member for Edmonton Decore.
Well, given that the report that I know the minister has found the government costs for diagnostic referrals and report interpretation were nearly $4 million more in 2021 than in 2019-20. Mr. Speaker, this cost was currently zero before that, and given that this obviously doesn't support the policy goals of cost containment, especially when adjusted for COVID, I once again ask the minister, will he rescind this detrimental policy and commit to involving Alberta's chiropractors, physiotherapists, audiologists, and the rest of the trained Alberta healthcare force before he decides to play with Albertans' well-being?
The Honourable the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As already indicated, this was introduced as a cost-saving measure, and part of the approach in terms of the cost-saving measure was be able to not only leverage the private plans, but also to ensure that people could actually still get the services through doctors. Again, as I indicated in my previous responses, if there is other evidence that shows that we can provide better service and manage our costs, I'm happy to talk with the associations in that regard.
The honourable member for Edmonton Manning has a question to ask.
Mr. Speaker, during the break, while the UCP were focused entirely on their internal drama, I had the opportunity to travel through southern Alberta to meet with the people this government has left behind and to hear their concerns, their fears, and what they want to see for their future. Southern Alberta and Lethbridge, in particular, has been hit hard by this government's war on doctors, and as a result, there are tens of thousands of people who aren't able to access primary care anymore. Can the Minister of Health say right now how many doctors have been hired to replace the physicians driven out of Lethbridge and southern Alberta?
The Minister of Health.
Well, I'd like to thank the honourable member for the important question. As I already answered with the honourable member from Lethbridge East, that we have put in place mechanisms to be able to improve primary care in Lethbridge. We are recruiting over 20 doctors in Lethbridge. 10 of them already have agreed to say yes, and we're waiting for their accreditation. We're also have offers open for locums for doctors in Lethbridge, Mr. Speaker, and that's the success of our system. Because as you know, Mr. Speaker, we don't hire doctors, but we are working very hard to ensure that we can attract doctors to the right level.
The honourable member for Edmonton Manning.
Well, given Lethbridge lost 40, that's a problem. And given that I heard loud and clear that good jobs are the path to thriving rural communities, but given that instead of investing in diversification and investing in rural economies, this government is actively eliminating jobs and the economic drivers in southern Alberta. Given that one only needs to look at how the UCP's healthcare privatization agenda has cost 4 jobs in Clarisholm, and likely another 90 are following very shortly. How can the Minister of Health or the Minister of Rural Economic Development claim to support southern Alberta when they are removing the economic driver in our rural communities? Will they commit to reversing these job losses in Clarisholm today?
The Minister of Health has risen.
Mr. Speaker, as I indicated previously in this House, there is a challenge with attracting and retaining healthcare workers in rural Alberta, and this is a challenge being faced not only here in Alberta, but across the entire country. Mr. Speaker, we are committed to be able to attracting and retaining not only doctors, but all healthcare professors, and Mr. Speaker, we are backing that up with dollars. $90 million last year, another $90 million this year. The programs to include the Rural and Remote Northern Program, $57 million, the Rural Medical Education Program, $6 million, the Rural Community Rural Clerkship Program. Mr. Speaker, I can go on, but we are focused on doing this, and we're having success. An example we just talked about with Lethbridge, and there will be more to come.
The honourable member.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that this government hurts rural families and communities by firing tens of thousands of educational assistants, not properly funding education, and leaving boards out to dry during this pandemic, and given that the crisis that they've created in education is made only worse by their failed curriculum rejected overwhelmingly by the teachers, the parents, the students, the school boards, the academics, the Indigenous communities, all in rural Alberta. And given that in order to build thriving rural communities, access to education is a must. So rather than try to defend the failed policies of this government and the lack of action, will the Education Minister look at the camera and promise to bring those educational jobs back to rural Alberta?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, that is just a load of bunk. There is no truth in it whatsoever, none whatsoever. And in terms of the curriculum, I just want to read from some rural assistant superintendent from West Wind School Division. I appreciate the listening voice the government has been throughout the piloting of the new K-6 curriculum in our division. I appreciate that they listened to some of our views in terms of the reasonable rollout plan. I may not have been exactly it may not have been exactly as I planned or I would have picked, but at least I can say I feel that I have been listened to and heard. And that
the honourable member for Grand Prairie has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many working families rely on childcare, and I was grateful on their behalf when we announced a Made in Alberta childcare deal with the federal government. I was even more pleased to see Alberta among the first provinces to roll out affordability dollars to both parents and operators. As a result, Mr. Speaker, I'm hearing from my constituents in Grand Prairie that are now saving real, hard-earned dollars on childcare. To the Minister of Children's Services, how many families are benefiting from this deal and what kind of savings are they seeing?
The Honourable the Minister of Children's Services.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I do want to thank the member for the question. Nearly 83,000 kids and their families are now benefiting from fee reductions, an average by half, Mr. Speaker, right across this province, and fees will continue to decrease as we move through this 5-year plan. Since signing the agreement, more than 28,000 additional children are also receiving subsidy, Mr. Speaker. Enrollment has gone up 30% as parents are going back to school, getting back to work, and driving our economic recovery, Mr. Speaker. This deal has in fact been great news for Albertans.
The Honourable Member for Grand Prairie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and again through you to the Minister for that answer. Given that we know parents need the benefit of options and flexibility when looking for childcare, and given that many parents rely on the variety and flexibility offered by many private spaces, and further given that nearly 60% of childcare programs currently in Alberta are private spaces, to the same Minister, what is being done to expand and protect these spaces in private childcare across Alberta?
The Honourable the Minister of Children's Services.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. That's a great question, as we fought hard to include private programs in our Made in Alberta agreement, many of which are run by female entrepreneurs. We negotiated as well, Mr. Speaker, for an additional 2,700 privately operated spaces to be included in this agreement since signing it, Mr. Speaker. Just like day homes and preschools, operators who were left out under the former government, we wanted to make sure that absolutely no licensed spaces were left out. We're working with the federal government, Mr. Speaker, on our expansion plan, and we'll have more details on new spaces very soon.
The Honourable Member for Grand Prairie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and again through you to the Minister. Given that we know this deal was built following the first consultation with the childcare sector in over a decade, a consultation that I was honoured to lead on behalf of the Minister, and given that this Minister clearly listened to Alberta parents and operators when creating this plan, and further given that this is a 5-year project that will include more savings for parents, workforce supports, and training for educators, to the same Minister, can you outline for the House what's next for Alberta parents in the childcare sector?
The Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As the member noted, this is a 5-year plan, and there is absolutely more to come. We chose to roll out affordability dollars first because, Mr. Speaker, we are here to represent working parents, get them back to work, and make sure that they can take part in our economic recovery. More spaces will be created in both facilities and day homes. And I do want to thank the member for Grand Prairie for her hard work in the first consultations in over a decade, Mr. Speaker, in this area. Roundtables are right now underway, confirming exactly how we should invest dollars into our workforce and supporting our early childhood educators. We're also going to be investing in staff and training the ones who are already in the system, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable members, that concludes the time allotted for oral question period in 15 seconds or less. We will proceed to the remainder of the routine, given that royal assent will take place this afternoon. The honourable member for Drayton Valley, Devon, has a statement to make.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Some would argue that everything in life is relative, yet others believe that there are moral absolutes where an action or belief is right all of the time, in any circumstance and in any era. For instance, a society that nurtures strong, creative, self-reliant people is better than a society where its people are dependent upon some version of an all-knowing and all-controlling government. That a commitment to limited government, majority rules, and respect for individual and minority rights is always better than supporting the unchecked self-interest of authoritarian rule. The conflict between Russia and Ukraine is not one of two morally equivalent nations. The facts are clear. Russia attacked Ukraine. Russia is an authoritarian state that has killed opposition politicians, restricted a free press, arrested dissident citizens. It is Russia that is bombing civilians, targeting hospitals and civilian infrastructure, and threatening its peaceful neighbors with the use of the atomic bomb and chemical warfare. To consider the actions of the two nations as morally equivalent is a grave injustice to the people of Ukraine. Albertans' support for Ukraine is not purely familial, cultural, or historical, but it is one built on the very foundation stones of deeply held common values. These democratic values are worth defending. In the Drayton Valley Devon constituency, the Breton Agricultural Society hosted a community supper that raised $40,000, a figure that will be multiplied 3 to 4 times by funneling it through the donations through the Food Grains Bank. The Rotarians in Drayton Valley organized a community supper that raised over $50,000. The Zerka dancers in the community of Kalmar raised close to $6,000. Private citizens have banded together and sent over plane loads of humanitarian supplies, and these are just the efforts that I am aware of. Clearly, Albertans understand that they must support those who defend freedom and democracy. The people of Alberta and Ukraine share a common set of values that are eloquently expressed in the Alberta motto, strong and free, and Albertans are prepared to help defend these values in Ukraine.
The honourable member for Central Peace Notley.
The Premier insists on absolute loyalty from everyone. That's being a team player. This aligns with the strategy that turning a blind eye to flagrant blunders is required on his team. The Premier's most important promises have all been broken. He pledged servant leadership. Instead, he wants an election if you don't support him. He wants a new base. He allowed interference in nomination races. And he had his cronies alter the rules of his own leadership review. Servant leadership? Promise made, promise broken. The Premier promised a grassroots guarantee, but made the rules for recall and citizens' initiative virtually unattainable and delayed implementing them. Grassroots democracy? Promise made, promise broken. The Premier swore he would fight for a fair deal. Instead, he stops at only words. As a result, the federal government has completely ignored the results of the equalization referendum. But don't worry, he'll write a letter. Fair deal? Promise made, promise broken. The Premier's mishandling of the pandemic has impacted every single Albertan in this province. He promised to fight against vaccine passports. He promised to vastly increase ICU capacity. He promised no mandates. Instead, no more ICU capacity. He brought in vaccine passports, and he allowed thousands of Albertans to be fired while him and his cronies partied on a patio. Promises made, promises broken. To my constituents and all Albertans, I must tell you, I am tired. I'm tired of corruption. I'm tired of policies being made to benefit the few. I'm tired of money being spent wastefully. I'm tired of complacency. I'm tired of politicians who are all talk and no action. I'm tired of an entitled elite political class that doesn't care about Albertans. I dream of a day when I can retire and hand this province off to my children and grandchildren. This is their world. We need to leave this province in better shape than we found it. We all have a role to play. We must be vigilant. We must never stop participating in democracy, and we must resist the temptation to become demoralized. We can change things, and together we will. In this House, our loyalty and duty is to Albertans, not to the failed leadership of one person. This is a duty I am proud to accept. How about you?
Reports by standing and special committees, presenting petitions, notices of motions, introduction of bills.
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Immigration.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I am honoured to rise and introduce Bill 17, the Labour Statutes Amendment Act. Mr. Speaker, this bill proposes changes that add clarity and flexibility to bereavement and reservist leaves and preserve the status quo for post-secondary bargaining agents. Mr. Speaker, I move first reading of Bill 17, the Labour Statutes Amendment Act, to preserve and improve employee protections.
The Honourable Minister of Labour has moved first reading of Bill 17, Labour Statutes Amendment Act 2022. All those in favour of the motion for first reading, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed, please say no. In my opinion, the ayes have it. That motion is carried and so ordered.
Bill 17, Labour Statutes Amendment Act 2022 is now read a first time.
The Honourable the Minister of Justice and the Solicitor General.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I request leave to introduce a bill, being the Justice Statutes Amendment Act 2022. Thank you.
The Honourable the Minister of Justice and the Solicitor General has moved first reading of Bill 20, Justice Statutes Amendment Act 2022. All those in favour of the motion for first reading, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. In my opinion, the ayes have it. That motion is carried and so ordered.
Bill 20, Justice Statutes Amendment Act 2022 is now read a first time.
The Honourable the Minister of Service Alberta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to request leave to introduce Bill 19, the Condominium Property Amendment Act of 2022. The changes proposed in this bill will better protect condo owners from unnecessary costs, and I'm looking forward to the debate on this important legislation.
The Honourable the Minister of Service Alberta has moved first reading of Bill 19, Condominium Property Amendment Act 2022. All those in favour of the motion for first reading, please say aye. Any opposed, please say no. In my opinion, the ayes have it. That motion is carried and so ordered.
Bill 19, Condominium Property Amendment Act 2022 is now read a first time. Tabling returns and reports.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Gold Bar.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have the appropriate number of copies of emails that I read into the record during debate on Bill 18 this morning. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Ellerslie.
Mr. Speaker, I have a requisite number of copies of a document that describes in well-defined what sentencing circles are all about, which I brought up in debate earlier today and yesterday afternoon.
The Honourable Member for Lethbridge West.
Thank you. I have several tablings, Mr. Speaker, and beg your indulgence. The first is a requisite copy of a document from 2009 outlining the indomitable NDP leader Brian Mason's concerns about the effect on electricity bills due to PC policies on transmission lines and Bill 50. I have the requisite number of copies as well, 5 copies from an April 21st, 2011 document that I referenced in bill debate this morning from the indefatigable Brian Mason on how power bills will jump dramatically as the PC government pushed ahead with massive new transmission lines. There's those 5. Yet another document from May 9th, 2011, from the inimitable Brian Mason, discussing how the provincial government was willfully blind to evidence of new power line construction that would send electricity bills through the roof. That one's 2011 as well. I also have the requisite 5 copies of the executive summary of University of Calgary School of Public Policy document released a couple of days ago. It's been referenced a few times in bill debate, entitled Why Are Power Prices So Darn High by Blake Schaefer, David Brown, and Andrew Eckert, to make sure that we have that for the record as well. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Are there other tablings? Seeing none.
Tablings to the clerk. Deferred divisions.
Honourable members, this afternoon, Royal Assent will take place, was scheduled for approximately 3 o'clock. We are going to stand in recess until 3:05. The House is recessed until 3:05. Order. Honorable members, if you'll take your seat. We are approximately 1 minute away from the resumption of the Assembly, as well as the beginning of the Royal Ascent ceremony. The Honorable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Her Honor, the Honorable the Administrator, will now attend upon the Assembly.
Mr. Speaker, Her Honor, the Honorable the Administrator awaits.
Sergeant at Arms, admit. Her Honor, the Honorable the Administrator. May it please Her Honor, the Legislative Assembly has, at its present sitting, passed certain bills to which, and in the name of the Legislative Assembly, I respectfully request Your Honor's assent.
Your Honor, the following are the titles of the bills to which Your Honor's assent is prayed. Bill 2, Financial Statutes Amendment Act 2022. Bill 4, Municipal Government Face Mask and Proof of COVID-19 Vaccination Bylaws Amendment Act 2022. Bill 5, Traffic Safety Amendment Act 2022. Bill 6, Emblems of Alberta Amendment Act 2022. Bill 9, Public's Right to Know Act. These are the bills to which your honour's assent is prayed. In Her Majesty's name, Her Honour, the Honourable, the Administrator, doth assent to these bills.
All rise, please.
Please be seated. Orders of the day. Orders du jour.
Under Government Bills and Orders for second reading. Bill 15, Education, Reforming Teacher Profession Discipline Amendment Act 2022. The Honourable Minister LaGrange.
The Honourable the Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is my honour to rise and move second reading of Bill 15, the Reforming Teacher Profession Discipline Act 2022. Bill 15 is about reforming the teaching profession's discipline process to create one system that serves the best interests of students, their families, the public, and the teaching profession in Alberta. This legislation builds upon the important work started with the Students First Act, which passed last fall. Mr. Speaker, Albertans deserve greater accountability, transparency, and timeliness in the teaching discipline process, and so do teachers. Bill 15 does just that, while also ensuring legislation and related regulations that oversee these processes do not present a conflict of interest. Alberta is the only Canadian province where the Teachers' Union has the sole responsibility set out in legislation for overseeing complaints of alleged unprofessional conduct and professional incompetence filed against their union members. There is no other avenue to address a complaint that questions a teacher's suitability to hold a teaching certificate. Mr. Speaker, this simply cannot continue, which is why the teacher discipline process needs to be improved with Bill 15. This legislation would create the Alberta Teaching Profession Commission and appoint a commissioner to oversee teacher and teacher leader conduct and competency complaints for the profession, regardless of where teachers are employed or their membership status is in the professional association. The goal is to have one legislative structure to govern matters of discipline for the entire teaching profession by one organization using a consistent, effective, and efficient process. Mr. Speaker, currently Alberta has a dual system process where the Alberta Teachers Association oversees discipline for its active members, while the Alberta Education Registrar oversees the discipline for all other teachers. The new model would ensure that all teachers and teacher leaders, including superintendents, are subject to the same disciplinary system. Bill 15 would bring Alberta in line with other jurisdictions and regulated professions, such as nurses, by eliminating the conflict of interest where a union could advocate for its members while also overseeing disciplinary matters. Let me be absolutely clear, Mr. Speaker. The Commissioner would be appointed by the Lieutenant Governor and Council following an open competition and would operate at arm's length from the Ministry. There are numerous examples where individuals are appointed by the Lieutenant Governor and Council. In fact, officers of the legislature, such as the Ethics Commissioner and Privacy Commissioner, are all appointed in this way and do objective work on behalf of the Legislative Assembly and the people of Alberta. I expect the same from whoever is selected to fill this commissioner role. Contrary to narratives I have heard from the Alberta Teachers Association and even the members of the opposition, Bill 15 would not give the Minister of Education the ability to influence or control the commissioner in the course of their duties or that of their office. And to be frank, Mr. Speaker, Bill 15 is not about consolidating power in the hands of the minister's office, as some critics have argued. This is about protecting students, not punishing the hardworking and dedicated teachers and teacher leaders across this great province. In the discipline model proposed in Bill 15, all complaints would be received by the registrar at Alberta Education and referred to the Commissioner, not to the Minister, for further action. Mr. Speaker, let me explain how this would work. Under Bill 15, the Commissioner would have the authority to address and investigate a complaint. The Office of the Teaching Profession Commissioner would review and investigate the matter and may initially dismiss the case. They may recommend a penalty under an expedited process or use consent resolution agreements, dispute resolution, or mediation to resolve the issue. If the Commissioner determines that the case warrants a hearing would be conducted by a panel. The panel would be comprised of teachers and public members who would render a decision on the matter and put forth a recommendation to the Minister of Education. Mr. Speaker, this is not a wholesale change from the current process, and we are simply making improvements to the process that will benefit students, parents, teachers, and teacher leaders. Currently, the Minister of Education has the final say on decisions made under the Registrar's hearing process and also has the final say on decisions that recommend suspension or cancellation of certificates under the ATA's discipline process. This is because the Minister of Education also holds the authority to issue a certificate in order to practice in the teaching profession. Mr. Speaker, these changes won't happen overnight, and we know the education system will need support to make the transition to the new system. To do this, we will ensure a smooth shift transition from the current system of teacher and teacher leader professionalism to the new Commissioner model with transitional regulations. For discipline matters that are underway when the new Act takes effect, transitional regulations would allow throughout the first half of 2023 for matters to continue in accordance with the rules under which they were started. During this transitional period, the responsibilities would shift, where appropriate, to the Commissioner and the Office of the Commissioner, as well as the newly appointed members of hearing and appeal committees. But the previous rules would be followed, and some matters, such as hearings that are currently underway, would continue until completion or June 2023, whichever comes first. The goal would be an effective and smooth transition while ensuring procedural fairness in dealing with current complaints. Mr. Speaker, we engaged with key stakeholders and education partners in February to hear their perspectives. Mr. Speaker, this did include the Alberta Teachers Association, as well as other education partners and victim advocacy groups. We also reviewed best practices in Canada. 2 provinces, Ontario and Saskatchewan, have self-governed professional regulatory organizations that issue teaching certificates and oversee matters of professional discipline for their teacher members, but they also have no union functions. British Columbia dismantled their Teachers College in 2011 because of a strong influence from the BC Teachers Federation that did not ensure public interest, resulting in the creation of a Commissioner's office that has been successful in that province. In all other provinces and territories, the provincial government is responsible for issuing teaching certificates and also play a varying role in overseeing teacher discipline processes that bring into question suitability to hold a teaching certificate. There are additional checks and balances in place for many of these jurisdictions, such as adjudicative committees comprised of teachers and public members or commissioners who operate at arm's length but have accountabilities to the Minister of Education in carrying out disciplinary functions. Mr. Speaker, it makes sense to keep the certification and discipline functions within the same organizational structure. And as I've stated, Bill 15 would bring Alberta teachers into alignment with other Canadian jurisdictions. This new model would not impact the role of the Alberta Teachers Association or the College of Alberta School Superintendents in their other roles and duties as professional organizations. In fact, it will give them the opportunity to focus on those important functions. A focus on professional learning is essential in maintaining the status of any profession, and it will enable the ATA and CAS to ensure teachers and teacher leaders in this province are current in their practice and enhance their skills to ensure student success. This model will also not impact the ATA's role as it pertains to collective bargaining. Alberta's government remains committed to strengthening the teaching profession through improvements to transparency, accountability, and public assurance. It is abundantly clear that Bill 15 demonstrates this commitment, Mr. Speaker. Albertans have raised concerns about the ATA playing both a union and a disciplinary role for its members and the potential for conflicts of interest that can arise due to this dual role. We know this simply cannot continue. The Students' First Act strengthened transparency, accountability, and safeguards for students, but it did not change the underlying structure of the discipline system. Bill 15 is the next step. Mr. Speaker, Bill 15 will restructure who is responsible for teacher discipline in Alberta, create a single, streamlined process, and separate discipline from advocacy functions. A commissioner model balances the need for an impartial and fair process with government's desire to increase oversight to protect students and the public interest. Bill 15 will reinforce that there is a duty to report to police when there may have been serious harm or threat to student safety. This is something already required under the Child, Youth and Family Enhancement Act, but as evidenced by recent cases, there seems to be confusion on who the duty to report falls on. Mr. Speaker, Bill 15 will clarify this process and affirm that everyone and anyone who is aware of potential abuse of a student or a child has a duty to report to police. The online teacher registry established under the Students' First Act will also be further enhanced. Bill 15 will make all hearings, appeals, and ministers' decisions, as well as consent resolutions agreements, completed with the Commissioner, where there is a finding of unprofessional conduct or professional incompetence. They will all be made available to the public. Bill 15 would also see the Alberta Teachers Association and the College of Alberta School Superintendents continue to focus on professional development and other member-focused services and advocacy. Mr. Speaker, this legislation would balance the need for an impartial and fair process while ensuring greater transparency, accountability in addressing discipline matters in the teaching profession. Mr. Speaker, I am honoured to bring Bill 15 forward. I hope that everyone in this House can agree that student safety should be paramount, and I look forward to discussing and debating this very, very important bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, honourable members. To respond, I see the honourable member for Edmonton Manning.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it is an honour to rise and speak to Bill 15, the Education Reforming Teachers Profession Discipline Amendment Act. It's got a long name. And I appreciate the minister standing up and sharing her thoughts and her vision of what this bill is intended to do. And because of that, I actually have quite a few questions, just based on some of the comments. And again, because we're in second reading, I hope that the minister will just appreciate my questions and maybe be able to come back at some point with an answer in regards to what we're going to be bringing forward. So, a couple things that came to mind for me when the minister was speaking was this idea of the commissioner. And this is, I think, one of the things that I'm really struggling with understanding when it comes specifically to this bill. And the reason for that is there's no other profession, nurses, doctors, social workers, which is what I was, that has what would be classified as a commissioner. They don't have that same requirement or structure. So we take our commissioners quite seriously, I would say, in this chamber. I mean, again, we heard the minister referencing comments around the ethics commissioner for an example. And commissioners that are in that role have a responsibility to have to report to the legislative offices. Their budgets are brought to elected officials. There is an accountability measure that is built in place that specifically relates to those roles. And the reason for that is because their role is to basically hold the Legislative Assembly to account and to ensure that there is ethical accountability, and all of those requirements that we see. So for me, what I think I'm not understanding and what I'm missing is I don't see how that structure would then exist underneath this current piece of legislation. To create such a powerful role, because I see commissioners in those contexts, especially if we're going to compare them to levels such as ethics commissioners, our privacy commissioner would be on the same level. Our other officers that are responsible to report to the Legislative Assembly, our elections, our officers, all of those roles are at a very significant level, and they are very close to the government and to the elected officials. And so when we look at this legislation and this position is being created, my question, because again, the minister clearly also said that this role would then make it so that the government wouldn't have influence. But yet, it is a role that is going to be appointed through an order in council. It is a role that would have conversations with the government, that would have conversations with elected officials. Currently, within the commissioner system that we have set up within this chamber, with, again, going back to the example that the minister used, the ethics commissioner, there are annual reports that are drafted. There is an accountability component to that. I don't see, and very specifically legislation that clearly articulates the role of the commissioner, I don't see within the legislation the accountability components, the same requirement to report back, the piece that regulates and administers and the discipline components, because ultimately, if there is a penalty that like if the ethics commissioner decided that there was a penalty for a sitting MLA, that there was something that didn't happen, let's say we didn't do our ethics disclosures on time, and there's an ability within the legislation to administer a penalty, that just happens. There is no minister that signs off on that penalty. If the elections commissioner determines that there has been a breach of the Elections Act, there is no minister that signs off on that and says, okay, well, you can initiate a fine. So to have a structure within this bill that says, well, there is a commissioner, they have all of these powers and responsibilities, but ultimately the recommendation still has to go to the Minister of Education to sign off and say that this can happen, doesn't make sense. It is not built into the same structure as all of these other commissioners' roles. And so I think there is fairness in the question of, then why is it being built this way? Why does the minister still have to have involvement and influence? And I think this is the question that Albertans are asking when they speak to, when the ATA asks these questions, when teachers ask these questions, is why then does the minister still have to have a level of influence? That's the trust question. That is the part where when the government says, just trust us, this process is going to be fair and transparent and all of the things, and that it will do what we say it's going to do, the response to that is, how do we trust it? How do we trust this legislation and this decision when it is set up in a way that actually does not align with the norm? Because the norm of how our commissioners currently work is there is no minister involvement at all. There's no minister that signs off on any decision that any of our legislative officers make. So why would we have a one-off? The one-off is what people are concerned with, because it's not actually mimicking the structure. And so I think that's the question and the conflict that the government's going to have to reassure teachers and parents and the ATA as to why it has to be this way. Because I'm concerned that that is the structure that has been created, but yet the minister is the ultimate sign-off. Because there is still a level of influence there that I don't think is necessarily answering the trust question. And it's worrisome. I mean, I think clearly what we see is that there is a conflict between the current government and the ATA and the relationship. And you know what? We've seen it in other provinces. It's not unique. What I do actually find kind of unique, though, of this legislation is, and in fact the minister spoke to this, is that they've adopted a model that is very similar to British Columbia's. Well, if we looked at any province in Canada that had the most conflict with teachers, I would say it would probably be BC. Teachers go on strike there all the time. So to follow the BC model, I find is a little bit interesting because it's obviously not a system and it's obviously not a structure that is necessarily working well. And I don't know why the minister wouldn't look at Ontario and Saskatchewan's model and say maybe that one makes more sense. We should look at adopting that. I mean, the minister did reference that those were other models that were explored and evaluated. So I guess my question to the minister around that too would be, why choose the one province that seems to have the most conflictual relationships with teachers, if there were other jurisdictions that obviously had models that maybe worked a little bit better? Because I think, again, the major concern that we continuously hear around this legislation is that relationship piece between the ATA, between the teachers, and between the government. And so for a piece of legislation to be drafted that mimics the most conflictual relationships across the country and not look at the models that actually are a little bit more harmonizing and work better together does send a signal. It sends a very clear signal that the conflict's it's okay. It's okay to have conflict because we know it doesn't necessarily work well in other jurisdictions. It's not necessarily working well in BC, but we're going to pick that one out of all the other models. The other thing that it was a question that came to my mind as well is that the minister had spoken about, the current impacts on whether or not there's a disciplinary process happening or not. And I am curious, and I don't know if the minister can actually answer this, is how many teachers are currently even going through this process. So this big shift, this big piece of legislation, this requirement to create a new body of a commissioner, create a new budget for a new office, all of the things. I'm curious how many teachers will actually be forced to go through this process in a given year. Will the monetary requirements, will the setting up of a new office, the salary associated with a commissioner, all of those things justify the amount of teachers that actually go through a disciplinary process? Or is this creating something purely based out of a conflictual relationship and we're going to hold the ATA to account? Because for a fiscal component, a fiscal party that believes that we should be cutting red tape and believes that we should try to minimize the amount of expenditures in government, then why are you creating a new office? And why are you spending a whole bunch of money on new salaries? And what is the conflict? Like, what is the benefit? What is the outcome? How many teachers are going to go through this for the return on the investment that this government's going to make into a new office for a new commissioner? So the government, because they don't like it when I talk about fiscal policy, because they don't think NDP people can, but unfortunately we can, are starting to talk back to me, which I'm used to, that's fine. The piece about it, though, is that this can be done, and this can be done in other ways. And now, again, we see it with the United Nurses Association. They have a disciplinary process. We see it with the Alberta Physicians Association. They have a disciplinary process. Social workers, which is what I was, has a disciplinary process. My profession didn't have a commissioner. And we were dealing with vulnerable children every single day, all the time. My responsibility as a child intervention worker was to make sure kids were safe. So I'm very aware of what we're talking about. My profession didn't have a commissioner. I had the same accountability within my profession. There is no question. In fact, my accountability and people watching what I was doing because of the children that I was working with was very, very high. Very high. There are mechanisms that already exist in other professions that do this. Well, then my question would be is why does it have to be a commissioner? No, I'm fine. It's okay. I mean, members want to ask me questions. I'm more than happy to talk about this. Because it doesn't pass the test, which is...
The honourable member, it will be me who decides, unfortunately. And so I would just ask the member that if there are comments that need to be made, perhaps wait until your opportunity to respond, which I believe actually might be next. So, the honourable member, please.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, or Mr. Speaker. And in fact, I thought you were doing an intervention. I was like, I don't think I get any on my 20 minutes. Not first speaker. So, again, just to follow up on some of the processes, is that, I mean, if the government wants to answer the question about how many current teachers are going through this process and how many have had to go through a disciplinary process, I'd be very interested to know that information. How prevalent is this that it is actually requiring such an extreme response by creating a whole commissioner's position? Why is there not if there's something wrong and there are concerns with the disciplinary process of how teachers are being held to account, the investigation, all the things, that's fair. I found it very interesting, though, that I also heard the minister make comments about, well, people didn't know who to report to. I have a really hard time believing that. And the reason I have a hard time believing that was because I was a child intervention worker, and many of my referral sources were teachers. In fact, the majority of my referrals were teachers, because they see kids every single day. They would report on their colleagues if they ever deemed a child at risk. And if there is a concern around teachers not knowing who to call and who to report to, then that is a question and an issue that the Minister of Children's Services should be addressing when it comes to education. That is an issue that the Minister of Education should be addressing when it comes to making sure teachers know who to call. But Albertans can call 911, they can call their local police officer, they can call 211, they can call Children's Services 1-883-429-2001, I believe is the number. There are many people that can be called. And I know people do it all the time because this was my job. So to hear that this needed to happen as well for clarity for teachers to know who to report to is not a function of legislation. It is a problem around education, and the minister having a responsibility to make sure that the professions within this profession know who to call, and working with their partners within cabinet to make sure that if there is a concern that teachers don't know who to call to make sure kids are safe, that there's an education program being set up by the Minister of Children's Services to make sure professions are being educated. No different than medical professionals and no different than daycare and childcare providers. Those conversations, those programs exist, those educational tools are provided to those professionals on a regular basis to make sure they know who to call. And I have a hard time believing that that would create a concern around legislation. What I think is happening is, again, it is an overreach of power by this government when it comes to how to create and how to address an issue. I am not saying that isn't an issue, by any means. I spent 12 years of my career working in child intervention services. I take this issue very seriously. But to create a commissioner for one profession and not for doctors, and not for nurses, and not for social workers, and not for all of the other professions, and to create such a high level that it's almost equivalent to a legislative office, to still allow the minister then to sign off on any disciplinary process, is speaking to a direct involvement in one profession and choosing that profession over every other profession. And we've seen a theme and conflict with this government and the teaching profession. And so I think the struggle that is happening here is, why does it have to be to this level? Was there not an opportunity to create similar mechanisms like every other profession in this province that addresses these issues? the Physicians Association, the Nursing Association, Social Workers Association, all of those have mechanisms, and they've worked. And if they haven't worked, they've never been brought to this chamber to be discussed and turned into a new piece of legislation. So there is something uniquely different here that the government has not been honest and transparent with Albertans about why this needs to be to such an extent. And that is where the trust issue comes from. That is what Albertans are concerned with. Why is it that it has to be in this structure that, and the Minister across will say this is about union support. The reality of it is that there are many other unions in this province that have structures that are not set up this way. And the ATA is an association, it's not a union, to clarify. So the point of this is that there is a significant difference. There is a significant difference. And I struggle with the fact that there is such a difference. And the fact that the government doesn't seem to want to engage with this conversation and wants to heckle and wants to try to make this about making sure children are safe, I think is disingenuous to this legislation. Because that's not what this is doing. There was a legislation that we had that was just in this chamber a while ago that was addressing those issues. This is about a structure, which is very, very different. This is an administrative piece of legislation. And the level of which the government has chosen to try to create what they are trying to determine as being a separate piece of legislation and an arm's length from the government is also disingenuous. Because a commissioner would be if the government couldn't sign off on the disciplinary piece. If the minister would like to amend the legislation that removes the minister from signing off on the disciplinary piece, then you know what? I guess there wouldn't be an issue. But the issue is you can't say it's one and not the other. Because if you're saying it's a commissioner who's going to be at arm's length, then a commissioner gets to invoke penalty and gets to invoke all of those things without the sign-off of the minister. But this isn't how it's set up. So it's either one or the other. But right now, the way the government has set it up is that it's not one or the other. The government wants to be able to have the vision or the optics of making it look like it's arm's length because they're making it as a commissioner position. But in the fine print, the minister still signs off on the disciplinary approval. That's not truly what a commissioner is. So then why is it a commissioner? Is it just because that's not the case? And I disagree with the minister when that's what the message box is, because that's incorrect. But the point of this is that there's something that doesn't make sense and it doesn't add up. And so the government needs to stand up and explain why that is.
Thank you, Honourable Member. The next individual member who commented is the Honourable Member for Fort McMurray Wood Buffalo.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. I am pleased to rise today to speak in favor of Bill 15, the Education Amendment Act. I first have to give a shout out, Mr. Speaker, to my good friend from Red Deer North, the Minister of Education. No one has demonstrated to me such strength, such fortitude, such ability to take such abuse, because God knows in our question periods, I see an opposition that increases in their decibels as they attempt to intimidate and bully the good member from Red Deer North. And I find that absolutely disgusting. Perhaps it's because she's a woman that they feel that they can do such things. And it is true. We can certainly measure that very, very easily. So I would certainly take that challenge on any day of the week. Now, I believe this bill will go a long way to increasing protection for both our children and our teachers, because this is just a much-needed bill. Parents should not have to worry about their children falling victim to inappropriate conduct, but one of the educators who've been entrusted with the well-being of their children during the school day. And I want to give a shout out to the member from my good friend from Edmonton, Manning, because she talks about the trust and the norm. So first off, let us talk about trust, shall we? And let's talk about those comments that I just made, that parents should not have to worry about their children falling victim to people who are in positions of authority, people that we entrust our kids with. To be clear, Mr. Speaker, I'm not against unions. I was a former member of the International Association of Firefighters. And the fights that we fought were good fights to ensure that safety measures were in place for our members, that we had the right equipment, and that we were supported appropriately, that things like mental health supports were in place for after we experienced such negative incidents. Hear, hear. But in this case, the ATA has demonstrated that they're just really a bunch of political hacks. They do not demonstrate a level of quality that we want to see in a group that is there to build their members. So, if I must say, as an example, during the NDP government of previous years, 2015 to 2019, when the NDP government chose to overhaul the entire curriculum and did not release any names of anyone involved in that restructuring and redevelopment of that curriculum. They would not release names. The ATA did not say anything publicly to criticize that NDP government. They said nothing, even though the fact was there that there were extremists that were identified as being members of those folks that were developing that curriculum. And nowhere have we seen an organization like that advertise so much political advertising that attacks one government or one group while negating the effects of the others. I find it just absolutely disgusting that this labor organization chooses to spend their money on advertising and attack ads as opposed to developing their members with balanced education. I have had teachers from my region, from my community, whisper in my ear that they dislike the education that the ATA has been providing them for the last half a dozen years, because it demonstrates a certain level of socialism and social justice that they don't necessarily agree with. It paints a picture of a very hard left union. And that's really disappointing that such a group is in charge when their members have to whisper in my ear that they do not feel that they have the freedom to speak to the truth. And that is disappointing, that they have to speak to the fact that they aren't being supported, that they are actually being provided with, for all intents and purposes, propaganda. And that is really disappointing. And yet the members across the way continue to support this group. If the ATA were to take a different approach and perhaps more balance and do what they do, which should be to support their members in certain labor issues, perhaps I might have a different perspective. But all I've seen is, I'll say it again, political hacks. People who do nothing but attack one governing party and support the other. They do not demonstrate any level of nonpartisan perspective. So, and you can see that when they discuss the curriculum. Mr. Speaker, they're attacking our government on the Indigenous content in the new curriculum that my good friend from Red Deer North has instituted, based on all the advisors and teachers that were building this curriculum. I did a review of this up in Fort Chipewyan, and I displayed all the content on Indigenous peoples. And the folks that came through and looked at it all, the only thing they told me were two things. A, that we shouldn't be teaching about residential schools in grades 1 through 6 because it is too harsh of something that they want these kids to learn. So they don't think that residential schools should even be taught in grade 1-6. Whereas the ATA, if you look at their talking points, were saying that we weren't teaching enough about residential schools. So who's doing the consulting there? Secondly, the only thing that they wanted to see in there was more language. They wanted to see the language of the Cree and the Dene promoted. And you know what, that's respectful. We have schools that are teaching Ukrainian and other languages, even Japanese and stuff. I think that's fantastic. Bilingualism is very important. I think Canadians would be well-to-do to learn other languages. But again, there's a blatant demonstration of ATA bias in attacking what they perceive to be as an inequality, but yet our government is demonstrating a high level of quality in providing Indigenous content. Yes. Now, yes, please.
Thank you. I just wanted to get up and answer a couple of the questions that were asked by the members opposite in terms of why a commissioner, why this arm's length approach. And I was happy to see the opposition really speak to the fact and recognize that a commissioner is a highly ethical, it elevates the whole office, that it is an individual who is highly skilled, highly ethical. In fact, the BC Commissioner for their teaching profession is a former ombudsman, has an extensive legal background. And the reason why we wanted to go with this model, and we looked right across Canada. We did a jurisdictional scan. We looked at every province. We looked to incorporate the best elements of every province. And so we do have elements of the Ontario process as well as the Saskatchewan process. And I think I'm running out of time.
Thank you so much. Do I have the ability to give my good friend the opportunity to speak one more time? Over.
She stands up. You can offer the intervention.
To finish her fine thoughts.
Thank you. And so we did look at all of those elements, all the jurisdictions, and took the best elements. We saw that BC has the commissioner, a highly skilled, ethical individual that works at arm's length. When we look at the fact that the minister has the responsibility for the certification of teachers, we felt it very, very important to continue that process, that the Ministry of Education is, in fact, the ones that certify teachers in this province. And so to have a a commissioner that would not, that would be acting totally independently would not serve the best interests of the whole process. We will continue. It is the Minister of Education's ability right now to ensure that they have the ability to cancel and suspend teacher certification in this province, and that will continue with the commissioner role.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. Back to trust. The Alberta Teachers Association Union is in charge of the discipline process for their members, but unions are designed to protect and advocate for their members, not necessarily discipline them. And as such, we know that there are many cases where there have been inappropriate conduct with a student that has led to the offending teacher being removed, but not necessarily being disciplined. And these people, these individuals, these teachers, these bad apples, if you will, move on to another jurisdiction and continue on. And that's shameful if the ATA executive choose to protect their reputation by not identifying these members that might be bad apples. Please.
This will be the third intervention.
This will be my final.
They're a minute long each, and 2 minutes will be added to your time as well after.
So, Mr. Speaker, you know what will increase trust is having public assurance. The fact that the commissioner will provide annual reports, that there will be hearing dates that will be posted, that decisions will be posted on the registry, that every Albertan can have access to. That creates trust because there's transparency, there's accountability, there's the ability for every Albertan. Right now, the members opposite said that her profession has a different process, but you know what? That profession is separate from the union. No other profession has the union overseeing their discipline process. And when we look at what happens currently under the ATA process, under their code of conduct, a teacher actually has to go and speak to another teacher before they report any issues that they have with that individual. So we need a single code of conduct for all teachers.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you so much to the Minister of Education for that clarity. Again, she points out some good thoughts there, and that is that Alberta is the outlier in the nation in regards to professional conduct as well as their labor side of things. So certainly it's good to see the separation of these two jurisdictions with the hope that we can have a fair process that protects children and not enables them. My good friend from Edmonton Manning also talked about, she talked about the norm, and that is the norm. And that's what our good minister is attempting to do with this, is to make sure that we are in alignment with the other provinces and territories in these two groups, and that there's no conflict of interest. Again, the ATA unfortunately has made decisions over the years to not prosecute, but what they don't their own members, what they don't realize is that there are bad apples everywhere in every single profession, whether it be physicians, teachers, firefighters, you name it. There's always some bad apples, and they have to be addressed and dealt with in such a manner. This single system for addressing complaints under the newly created Alberta Teaching Professions Commission, which will be headed by a commissioner to oversee the teacher and teacher leader conduct and competency complaints for all teachers and teacher leaders equally. And that is fantastic, because under this system, the registrar at Alberta Education will be responsible for the intake of all complaints. And this will avoid duplicate complaints. And then these complaints that will be forwarded to the Alberta Teaching Profession Commissioner will have the authority to address and investigate a complaint and determine the most appropriate course of action to take regarding a complaint. I think this is fantastic news, because it increases accountability and transparency by expanding the online teacher registry established under the Students First Act by making publicly available information on hearings, appeal dates, and et cetera, as the good minister has explained to us earlier. And again, these changes will ensure that the entire teaching profession is protected by bringing all teachers and teacher leaders under one reformed disciplinary process and put forth the best interests of students and their families and teachers and the public at the center of the teacher discipline process. This is a fantastic bill that just makes sense. And again, it is definitely reflective of the good minister that has crafted this up. And I think she's doing excellent work for Albertans and for children. And whether the ATA realizes it or not, I know the general population of teachers respect and appreciate this bill and understand that. For the average taxpayer, they can probably feel rest assured that their money won't be spent on political advertising, and will perhaps focus more on their education of their teachers to ensure that they are also supported. Now, Mr. Speaker, the Teachers Union claims that this bill is an attack on teachers, the teaching profession, Alberta's education system as a whole. In fact, again, I just disagree with that entirely. When you look at the actions of the Alberta Teachers Association executive over the last 5-6 years especially, it's just disappointing to see how they behave in the act and how political they have become. I had a parent write to me, tell me, why do I criticize the ATA executive? Because they're a neutral, nonpartisan group. And I literally could respond with good honesty and facts about a lot of the partisan messaging and rhetoric that they have. And I can certainly demonstrate that certainly now with, again, the curriculum criticisms. And still to this day, they're very effective at their communicating, because I'm still getting some parents that are expressing concerns about this widespread curriculum change, even though the fact that the good minister has actually pared it down and is providing it piecemeal, just certain subject matters and certain grades. And she's doing a good responsible. Say again there?
Through the chair. So just, there
Through
will
the
be
chair? You there, the fellow that just went to Mexico this Christmas.
There will be opportunities after your comments for others to comment as well. However, comments, as always, go through the chair. At this time, there are no more interventions, unfortunately. So if the honourable member could please continue.
Yes, you can continue to heckle there, member of Edmonton Gold Bar. So I'm sure you're still recovering from your holidays overseas as well, hey? after criticizing some of our members.
Members, I would just remind that we are currently on second reading of Bill 15. If we could please keep our comments towards the bill. Thank you.
I digress, Mr. Speaker. My apologies for responding to the heckling from the member for Edmonton Gold Bar. He's got a big mouth and he just continues on. So,
Member, I don't think that that would be considered parliamentary to directly.
You know what? I apologize, Mr. Speaker, and I withdraw the comments.
I consider the matter completely closed. Please, if the honourable member continue.
So, to clarify, I do have the utmost respect for teachers and the work they do as they prepare our children for the future by making sure that kids have the skills and competencies needed to succeed. And I believe that virtually all teachers have that quality to ensure that. But again, we now and again have our bad apples, and we have to make sure that they are addressed in the most appropriate way so that our kids are protected. And not only our kids here, but in other jurisdictions as well. So, with that, Mr. Speaker, I just want to sum it up and say that teachers need not be worried about this legislation. This is in the best interest of everybody involved. And again, if they have any worries about trust and the norm, as the previous member who spoke from Edmonton Manning has stated, that this bill does exactly that. Ensures that there is trust, ensures that we are in the norm with this, that we are doing what all the other provinces are doing. That has been proven time and time again to be the most effective level of managing these issues. This bill is a common sense approach to teacher discipline, and I will proudly vote for it. And again, I strongly encourage all members of this House to do the same, to vote to support this bill. And I want to thank the good Minister of Education for her hard work and her endeavors as she continues to do the best things for our children. And God bless her. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Honourable Member. Are there any members wishing to join debate? I believe I see the Honourable Member for Edmonton Riverview.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and it's my pleasure to join the debate on Bill 15, Education Reforming Teacher Profession Discipline Act Amendment Act 2022. So it's pretty clear from the previous speaker and many of the actions of this government that this government is afraid. And they are not able to actually let civil society operate. They need to control everything. And this bill is taking away a profession's self-regulating authority, which is a fundamental principle of any profession. It's ridiculous. There's 5 main characteristics of being a professional. So you have a self-regulating profession. And so this is taking away that opportunity for teachers. There's a code of ethics, standards of practice. Sometimes there's different words for these things, but these are the values, beliefs, principles of any profession that you adhere to, and on a regular basis. Each year, for example, I'm a registered social worker in the province of Alberta. Every year, I must review once again my code, my standards, make sure that my continuing competence is up. If there is a complaint placed against me, of course I must go through the regulating process. I mean, this is just an ongoing thing of being a professional. There's also a special scope of practice, so there's a unique area of practice that you have that's exclusive to your profession. There's a knowledge base that actually professionals within that profession seek to augment. They do research to add to that knowledge base. And then there's mandatory registration so that all members of that profession are part of that. So there's 5 characteristics of a profession. And so this government, in one fell swoop in this bill, is just, annihilating a significant piece of that. So it's so disrespectful and untrusting of teachers. It is just abhorrent what they're doing, and they think they have the right to do that. But this is a fundamental piece of being a professional around the globe. This is fundamental. And it boggles my mind, but all I can figure out from what this government does repeatedly on many issues, and certainly on this one, is that they're afraid, that they're terrified, and so they have to muzzle and keep people quiet. And so this is what the minister is doing here. And so she's taking control and hurting an independent profession to be able to self-regulate. You know why it's important to self-regulate? Because if I'm, say I have a complaint against me, and it's someone who's reviewing whatever the situation, doesn't understand the values of my profession, doesn't understand the code of ethics, the standards of practice, they don't have a good understanding of what my responsibilities are in that role. And so that's why self-regulation is so important, so that I'm not being assessed by a lawyer, because a lawyer doesn't know what I'm doing. And certainly if anybody's been cross-examined in a courthouse, and I certainly have when I used to be a social worker in child welfare, the lawyers just denigrated your profession. They made fun of you, and that's kind of how the law system works. But in this, there's a sincere attempt to look at the kind of work that you do and understand it, and you understand it from the value base of your profession. And so that is being totally wiped out by this government right now. And again, I just say that why are they doing this? I think that they're fearful and they want control, and they don't really, even though we hear some of the rhetoric that they want to hear from people, they don't. They only want to hear from certain people. And the rest of us, professionals, I mean, they tear up the agreement with the docs unilaterally. The Minister of Health, it's one of the first acts he did. It's ridiculous. It's despicable. It's sickening. And guess what? We've just been through this pandemic. We're not through it. It's still with us today. But guess what? Let's attack people who are working the hardest to take care of Albertans who are overcome with COVID. Let's attack, health professionals. Let's cut the wages of health professionals. Please. I don't understand. And you know what? Albertans don't get it either. Albertans don't trust this government. It's so clear. And they know that they're certainly not caring about the professionals who have put themselves in harm's way during this pandemic. They're showing so little respect. Teachers, I have a lot of teachers that have reached out to me. Certainly in my riding, there's many teachers, and they, class sizes are ballooning. There's so much responsibility, all the protocols around COVID, all the challenges of going online, all the things that they've done. This government doesn't care about that. This government just wants to make it harder. And of course, we've all talked about the fiasco of the curriculum many times. And the previous speaker said, oh yeah, the curriculum's great, and we shouldn't talk about this, and we shouldn't talk about this, That's not how education works. Of course we need to be age appropriate, but kids need to hear about the realities that have gone on, and certainly our colonial history. And we know very clearly that, the Northwest Territories always used Alberta's curriculum, and they are not, because of the abysmal job that the UCP have done on this matter. So please, this is a government afraid. And this is just another way for them to control a profession that they don't like their views or their values. And it's just like my profession, social workers. Last spring, there was a bill passed in this House that meant that the Alberta College of Social Workers had to separate. It had to have the college separate from the association. And the Alberta College of Social Workers isn't very big. It's only about 8,000 members. And so this is the death knell. This is the death knell for the association. And I worked there for 10 years before I was elected in this House. And I'm very proud of the advocacy work we did, how we work with government. I know I was involved with lobbying government to have an independent child and youth advocate during that time. And that work is important, and that is civil society work. That's professions, regular citizens speaking up about what they care about. But you know what this government thinks when people do that? That they're troublemakers, they shouldn't be listened to, they have to be silenced. So, the separation of my profession, and making that happen, it's actually, the new association hasn't quite been created yet, although it's in the process, is, silencing a lot of members of the Alberta College of Social Workers. And it really breaks my heart because it feels like that is a really vital part of a healthy society, is that people have outlets to speak about it. And certainly as a social worker, my values of social inclusion, making sure that no one's left behind, that humanitarian values, social justice values, all of these things are, so important to me. And of course, they brought me into this house, and that is why I actually became a politician, was because I wanted a bigger platform. I wanted to be able to have more authority and power to speak about these things. But I didn't think that when I came into this position that my profession would be attacked, and that would be the thing the UCP thought was important. Like, why silence people who have, important views to share? And to hear the members opposite, they just think, well, you shouldn't care about social justice. Well, why not? Like, I don't understand that. So it is about silencing people. It is about silencing professions. And, I really, asked the members in this House to vote against this bill because it is taking a fundamental characteristic and responsibility of any profession to self-regulate, taking that totally out of it. So it really weakens the profession significantly. So, and I really want to ask the members opposite, why are they doing this? They're doing this because they're afraid. And they don't care about civil society. They only care about people who think like them. And it's so clear from all the things they've done, so many things they've done unilaterally, to be disrespectful and not be inclusive. And it's evident in so much of what they're doing. So besides, the Alberta College of Social Workers, which is the profession that I belong to, that they're separating that. There's another college that certainly I've had contact with, but it came out of the Association of Counselling Therapists of Alberta. And this government promised them some time ago that they would create a regulatory college for them. And they did all the homework, got everything going. But guess what? Now they don't want to do it. Now the minister is dragging his feet on that. So this is just another example of how much the UCP are afraid of professions and certainly don't want to give them any kind of rights or authority. And, we know that people having a regulated college of professionals actually is in the public interest. It actually protects the public. And certainly, teachers, of course, are dealing with people in the school system, young people. These are children. In the Alberta College of Social Workers, we work with children all the time, and we're a self-regulating body. Certainly, health professionals do that. So, who's next? Who's next? Who else is going to be, stripped of this self-regulating power? Many of us work, you say it's for the kids, but is it? I think that there's another hidden agenda, perhaps, that the minister needs to be more honest about. That it is, okay, these guys are bugging me, so I'm just going to, give them a bit of a hard time here. I'm going to take away this fundamental power of being a profession. So, this legislation is, just, again, I will say it, is that it's just really denigrating, I think, teachers, and it's not respecting civil society. It's not making sure that citizens have voices to speak up. in our province, and it's certainly not about protecting children. It's not. It's not at all. It is a political game by this minister and this government to take control of the regulation, the self-regulation of teachers in our province, because they're mad at teachers. And, we definitely cannot trust the UCP government. And I mean, this has been demonstrated time and time again, and we see it. I was like stunned that this was something that was, pretty quick legislation that came through when my professional college was split. And, honestly, it is the death knell for it. And it's not going to, their ability to advocate, speak up, which is, of course, what we want in a civil society, but not if you're afraid. And the UCP seems to continue to be too afraid to actually have robust public discourses, political discourses, because of I don't know, they have thin skin, or they don't have very good arguments, and they don't have to speak about them or explain them. I'm not quite sure what it is exactly that they're afraid of. I mean, but it's just been demonstrated time and time again, you're not, if you're not following our rules, if you're not doing what we say, we don't want to hear from you, or, hey, we're going to cut your funding. And certainly, I have lots of contacts with the nonprofit sector, and people are afraid all the time. And it's happened so much already that, seniors in housing, when we were government, we put in $2 million in nonprofits, senior centers, things like that, to support people, to age in their communities. Guess what UCP did? As soon as they got in, they slashed that budget to below $1 million. And, this makes so much sense, to keep people in their communities. But guess what? Nonprofits, they can't say anything because they're afraid. They'll feel like they'll be even more likely to have budget cuts. And then they'll be able to do even less because, this is a punitive government. And if you speak up against them, hey, they're going to discipline you for that. And that's exactly what this bill is about. It's about keeping ATA weak.
Thank you. The next honourable member that caught my eye is the honourable member for Grand Prairie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much for the opportunity to rise late on a Thursday afternoon and speak to Bill 15. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity, and I'll just start off by reiterating something that the minister said when she introduced the bill into second reading. She said that this really is about protection for students and not about punishing teachers. And I just wanted to reiterate that again. Like many of my colleagues on this side of the House, I'm rising today to express my support for this bill. I've had some conversations in my constituency office with teachers and administrators trying to figure out what the purpose is, and they had valid questions, and we've answered those questions. I really believe that this is important legislation, and it's coming forward at an important time. It will reform the discipline process for teachers, teacher leaders, and administration to make the education system safer for students. And the members opposite have said, why? Why this? Well, that's the answer, to make the system safer for students. This is about our kids and their kids. Bill 15 will create a streamlined, effective, consistent, and efficient discipline process. The disciplinary process will have a set timeline wherein action must be taken within 30 days of a complaint. I also think that's critical because as it stands now, it can take a long time, and teachers can remain in this system where there's question. It's not good for the teacher, it's not good for the classroom, it's not good for the students that may be involved. So I really think that's a key element to this, is the timeline. An additional 30 days will be provided for these measures to begin. Mr. Speaker, right now the Alberta Teachers Association functions as judge, jury, and lawyer, right? They're there to determine the proceedings, but they're also there as an advocate for the defendant. That seems a bit flawed to me. They have disciplinary power, and because they also serve as the union, I believe it increases the chance of a conflict of interest, and certainly the perception of that. Our priority is the safety and education of students. This bill will enhance the accountability and the transparency of the teaching profession. And I actually have spoken to teachers who support that theory, that concept, that intention. It will further protect students and give parents peace of mind. Mr. Speaker, the decision to put forth this legislation is not one that was taken lightly. And I want to thank the Honourable Minister of Education, as others have this afternoon, for all the hard work that she's put into this bill and all of the dedication she's demonstrated in not wavering in her commitment to Alberta's students. The goal here is to implement the best practices, period. After examining other key provinces and other comparative provinces, as well as other Alberta professions like engineering and nursing, in all cases, the union and disciplinary functions were carried out by separate organizations, and I think that's key. We've heard from members opposite said that that's not the case. Well, that is the case, Mr. Speaker. This is how we came to the decision to implement a structure that combines the effectiveness of the commissioner model in British Columbia with the arm's length features of Saskatchewan's Teacher Regulatory Board. Mr. Speaker, Alberta is behind, as many other provinces already have their own disciplinary bodies. The current disciplinary structure has been in place for 85 years, and it's time for change. And so one of the members opposite said that we were motivated by fear. I'm not motivated by fear, Mr. Speaker. I'm not scared to make change. That's why I ran for office. And I'm not scared to say that we need to make a change here because we need to protect students. The existing system is difficult to navigate, and it causes a fear of reprisal from one's own association, as it currently sits. In contrast, Bill 15 empowers teachers and administration and allows for the duty to report under the Child, Youth and Family Enhancement Act to be carried out dutifully. A concerned parent found it disturbing that, and I quote, the ATA felt they had no duty to report criminal acts involving children to police because they felt it might jeopardize their own hearing process, end quote. That's the reason, Mr. Speaker. That's why we're here today talking about Bill 15. That is the point. Mr. Speaker, the goal here is to protect students, Alberta's children, and ensure they have a safe environment to learn in. Alberta currently does not have a sole organization to protect and advocate for them, and with this bill that will change. A Commissioner's office balances the needs for an impartial and fair process with the government's desire to protect student interests. Any and all accusations that this change is a direct attack on teachers is simply a tactic being used by the ATA or the members opposite to create fear amongst their members in an attempt to retain their own power and control. That's not what this is about. This shouldn't be about politics. This should be about kids. The implementation of Bill 15 would lead to greater accountability, public assurance, and consistency in addressing complaints under one legislated governance structure. And I see the Minister is rising to intervene, and I welcome that intervention, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. And I just want to build on what I'm hearing from my colleague, because what I heard from the members opposite was that they're really more concerned about protecting the union than they are protecting children. Yep. This is not about protecting the union. This is not about retaining power within the union. This is about making sure that there is a independent, fair, accountable process that when these terrible situations happen, and I, again, want to reiterate, the vast majority of teachers are amazing, caring, wonderful individuals, and they have our respect. But when these situations happen, there has to be a process in place that is fair, transparent. And the members opposite said, we're not listening. You know what? We are listening. We're listening to parents. We're listening to victims. We are listening to victim advocacy groups. We're listening to child advocacy groups. We are listening to teachers. We're listening to administrators, to superintendents, all who have said we need to change this process.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the Minister took the words right out of my mouth. The next sentence I literally was going to say is that the vast majority of teachers in this province are professionals who value and protect the safety of students. They care about their students, and they will likely never have any involvement with this process. That's not what Bill 15 is about. It's not about vilifying good teachers. It's about dealing with the ones that aren't. That's the point. This legislation will elevate the status of the teaching profession by removing any perception of conflict of interest. I've had teachers tell me that in my office. The Alberta Teaching Profession Commissioner will have the authority to address and investigate a complaint and determine the most appropriate course of action to take regarding that complaint. But as is currently the case under the Education Act, the Minister will have the final decision on a penalty for unprofessional conduct or professional incompetence. That's a second piece of oversight, and I don't see the problem with that. I actually think that that enriches the system. Transitioning and implementing a new system can be challenging, and we've heard that this afternoon. During this period, the responsibilities would shift where appropriate to the Commissioner and newly appointed members of hearing and appeal committees, but the previous rules will be followed. As a result, procedural fairness will be followed while also ensuring an efficient transition into a fully operational single model for teacher and teacher-led leader professionalism in Alberta. And I'm going to wrap up because I see that the time is getting close to the end here, Mr. Speaker. The cost of implementing this change, I can tell you the cost of not implementing this change are kids. The fact is, Mr. Speaker, that this change is not about politics. It's about doing the right thing for students and the right thing for the profession. An examination of sexual assault cases involving staff at kindergarten to grade 12 schools in Canada, carried out by the Canadian Centre for Child Protection, found 714 employees or former employees were linked to sexual offences against school children between 1997 and 2017. This is unacceptable, Mr. Speaker. That's 714 too many. And that's what Bill 15 is trying to do, is to deal with that issue. We do not want any more exposure to Alberta's kids. Blatant abuse of power by adults in positions of power is a type of behavior that should never be tolerated, no matter who you are in this province. I'm going to skip over some of my notes because, again, I see our time is short. Does the Minister have another intervention?
Yes, just
Welcome
a really quick one. I had heard a question about what is the return on investment, and like my colleague, the return on investment is what is the cost of the damage to our children, to their futures. I have heard stories from victims that now are suicidal because of the damage that has been done by a teacher, someone that they should have been able to trust. The trust that's broken between children and their teachers, the trust that's broken with the parents. This is a lifetime of damage. This cannot continue. And if we can do anything that makes it better, why wouldn't we do it? We have a system that's been in place for over 85 years with little to no change. We have a dual system. Why don't the members opposite want to see a single system that is actually going to be independent, arm's length, accountable, transparent to the public?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Like many others in this House, I am a parent. I'm a parent of 3 now adult children. But how would I feel if something had happened to any of my children during the course of their education? Horrified, Mr. Speaker. I cannot imagine. And I would not forgive a government that turned a blind eye knowing that this was a problem. Period. So again, I commend this minister for her dedication to Alberta's kids, and to my kids, and to your kids. Mr. Speaker, the impacts of the misuse of authority have devastating and long-lasting effects, as the minister just mentioned. There are students with who've contracted incurable sexual infections from teachers. That's an extreme case. But that's the impetus behind Bill 15. There are children that have told us that they had to keep their mouth shut for 3 years, and that was one of the most horrific and destructive experiences of their life. We don't want that to ever happen again in Alberta schools. And again, the vast, vast majority of teachers are incredible, wonderful people. This will not impact them at all. We're finding the bad apples and getting them out of the system. In instances like the ones I just mentioned, kids are robbed of their childhoods. They're made adults way too young. And there's no way back from that, Mr. Speaker. The damage is done. These events are horrific and they're heartbreaking, and they should never occur. Full stop. While we do everything in our capacity to prevent these situations, sometimes they still happen. When they do, there needs to be a body to hold perpetrators accountable for their actions, and that's why, Mr. Speaker, I wholeheartedly support this change in legislation. And again, I thank the minister for her work on it. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I move to adjourn debate.
Having heard the motion to adjourn debate as proposed by the honourable member for Grand Prairie, all those in favour of adjourning debate, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. Carried. I see the honourable Deputy Government House Leader has risen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think we've accomplished a ton of work this week here in the legislature. Grateful for all the hard work of members on both sides of the House. And at this time, I would move that the Assembly be adjourned until 1:30 p.m. Monday, April 25th.
Thank you. All those members in favor of the motion as proposed by the Deputy Government House Leader, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. That is carried. The Assembly stands adjourned until Monday at 1:30 p.m.